Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to Italy. Not the postcard one with sunlit piazzas and endless gelato, but the older, candlelit version that smelled faintly of tallow, damp stone, and ambition. The one where artists dreamed of immortality and merchants dreamed of tax loopholes. So get comfortable. Pull the blanket up, dim the light, let the modern world fade a little. We're going to the Renaissance, an age that thought of itself as reborn, yet still clung lovingly to every medieval superstition it could reach. We're not here for the usual gallery of geniuses. No Leonardo, no Michelangelo, no popes waving fresco commissions around like coupons. Tonight's story belongs to the women who were never meant to have stories. The courtesans, those half-acknowledged, half-erased figures who learned to survive in a world designed to forget them. The word courtesan itself drifts elegantly off the tongue. In Italian, cortigiana, a woman of the court. Respectable, almost. Which was the point. Society could stomach its sins better when they were dressed in Latin. Picture Venice around 1500. Moonlight sliding over canals, the sound of oars dipping like a slow heartbeat. Above the waterline, the city gleamed, towers, arches, and behind shuttered windows, 1,000 tiny conspiracies. Venice was rich, proud, and spectacularly corrupt. It was also, paradoxically, one of the few places where a clever woman could make herself heard, if she knew how to whisper in the right ears. Veronica Franco did. She was born to a modest family. Her mother, also a courtesan, taught her the essentials: music, poetry, conversation, and the delicate art of pretending to be impressed. Veronica absorbed it all and added something new: intellect. She wrote verse that mixed tenderness with menace, letters that sounded like love until the last sentence, when you realized she was dissecting her correspondent's ego. In her terse rhyme, she advised women to cultivate their minds as gardens of reason. Which was bold, considering half her readers believed reason was a masculine organ. She debated philosophers, flirted with kings, and once faced the Venetian Inquisition with the kind of composure most people reserve for afternoon tea. They accused her of witchcraft. Naturally, intelligence in a woman tended to confuse them. She replied so calmly that they released her, though they made sure to ruin her finances just to restore moral balance. Venice categorized its sex workers with bureaucratic precision. There were the meretrici publish, street girls taxed like livestock, and above them the cortigiani onest, the honest courtesans, who could read, dress lavishly, and host salons filled with senators pretending to appreciate poetry. The honesty referred not to chastity, but to professional transparency. Everyone knew the terms. These women became ornaments of the Republic, unofficial ambassadors of charm. A visiting diplomat might leave Venice with a treaty in one hand and a sonnet in the other, both negotiated in the same bedchamber. It wasn't diplomacy exactly, but it worked. The paradox was delicious. Men proclaimed moral outrage in public while competing for invitations to the courtesan salons in private. It was hypocrisy elevated to an art form, and nobody performed it better than Renaissance Italians. Let's drift a little farther south now, where marble and theology meet: Rome. By the mid-1500s, the papal city was less holy sanctuary and more theatrical empire. Cardinals hosted banquets that would shame Bacchus. Popes commissioned nudes for the Sistine Chapel ceiling and then complained about indecency. Within this whirl of sanctified excess moved the Roman courtesans, luminous and untouchable, half angel, half scandal. Among them glowed Tullia di Aragona. She claimed to be the daughter of a cardinal, perhaps true, perhaps strategic myth-making. She was poet, philosopher, and conversational dualist. Her beauty drew attention, her intelligence kept it. She wrote a philosophical dialogue on the nature of love, daring to suggest that women might experience passion and reason simultaneously, a theory that sent scholars reaching for their rosaries. Tullia debated men in public salons, wielding logic like perfume. When one philosopher tried to corner her with Aristotle, she countered with Plato and a smile, reminding him that both had died single. Her poise terrified them. They adored her until she spoke. Then they quoted scripture about silence. That double standard was the air these women breathed. Respectable wives were meant to obey and produce heirs. Courtesans, paradoxically, could speak freely precisely because they were excluded from respectability. Freedom through exclusion, one of history's crueler bargains. Yet from that narrow ledge, they influenced art, politics, and literature. They advised dukes, inspired sonnets, and occasionally funded painters who would later erase them from the finished canvas. Their names survive mostly in the margins, the way light lingers after a candle's gone out. Florence, meanwhile, tried to regulate morality with municipal enthusiasm. Brothels paid taxes. Officials kept lists as meticulously as they kept church accounts. It was civic virtue by spreadsheet. But the courtesans danced around the rules. They rented discreet apartments near the Arno, employed poets as secretaries, and held salons where the talk moved from Plato to gossip without anyone noticing. One Florentine diarist wrote, "The courtesan's house is a school of wit. Many go in dull and come out philosophers." He meant it as criticism. It reads as compliment. Their power was fragile but real. A whispered suggestion could redirect a patron's loyalty, shift a political alliance, even decide which painter received the next commission. Men imagined themselves masters. They were often marionettes, gently guided by silk threads. And beneath all the wit and candlelight was the constant threat of ruin. A patron dies, a rumor spreads, a rival gains favor, and the courtesan falls overnight from salon centerpiece to scandal. Most faded quietly into convents or poverty. A few, like Veronica Franco, left words behind as proof they had existed. Franco once wrote, "Let me be judged by my verses, not my body." It's tempting to read that line as defiance, but there's exhaustion in it too, the tired knowledge that the world preferred bodies to verses. Still, they persisted. They learned that education could be both shield and weapon. They studied music, philosophy, rhetoric, the subjects reserved for men, and used them as instruments of survival. When society closes the door, clever women, as always, learn the architecture. Imagine the scene, a dim Venetian chamber, tapestries heavy with dust, the scent of oranges and wax. A senator reclines, quoting Petrarch badly. Across from him, Veronica Franco listens, half smiling. She corrects his meter gently, then changes the subject to trade tariffs, steering him toward a decision that will benefit her cousin's shipping business. The senator leaves thinking he seduced her. She knows she's just edited policy. That was power, soft, deniable, effective. Even their wardrobes spoke strategy. Courtesans wore colors forbidden to married women: crimson, gold, deep violet. The church called it vanity, they called it marketing. Their hair, often bleached with lye to achieve that luminous Venetian blonde, became a symbol of both allure and danger. Pain disguised as glamour, very Renaissance. Outside their salons, the city teetered between adoration and condemnation. Priests thundered about sin, while nobles quietly funded their favorite courtesans' dowries or tombs. Venice even had laws dictating which districts they could live in, close enough to attract visitors, far enough to maintain moral distance. The result was a geography of hypocrisy mapped onto the city itself. And through all this, these women managed to leave intellectual fingerprints everywhere. Some corresponded with ambassadors, others with artists. Painters like Titian and Tintoretto borrowed their faces for saints and muses, because who else could hold a viewer's gaze so knowingly? There's a quiet irony there. The women condemned for tempting men became the eternal symbols of purity in art. History has a sense of humor that way. As night deepens in our story, imagine the sound of a lute drifting from an open window, the faint echo of laughter that might be flirtation or strategy. In those moments, the courtesan's world feels almost weightless, a dream balanced on wit and perfume. But beneath it lies centuries of constraint, pushing back. They weren't revolutionaries in the loud sense. They didn't storm palaces or write manifestos. Their rebellion was subtler, a well-timed compliment, a poem that survived censorship, an education smuggled in under the pretext of charm. It was resistance disguised as elegance. And when you think about it, that's very human. Most real change doesn't arrive with trumpets. It whispers from behind the curtains, carried by people who were never supposed to matter. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, remember them, the women who turned conversation into currency, who taught Europe that intelligence could wear perfume, and who proved that influence doesn't always look like power. Because when history closes its main doors, there's always someone quietly unlocking a side entrance. Now, if you were living in 16th century Venice, what path would you have chosen? Would you risk everything for freedom of thought, or play it safe within the rules? Tell me in the comments, unless, of course, you've already drifted off. Let's move gently toward where we'll wander through the glittering courts of Florence and Rome again, watching how these same women began shaping politics itself. For now, breathe slow, and let the ripples of the Grand Canal fade into sleep. Let's drift onward. The canals fade, the moonlight on Venetian water slowly turns to the glow of another city. This time, we're in Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, where every building seemed designed to remind ordinary people that they were, in fact, ordinary. Florence was a city obsessed with perfection. Art, architecture, banking, and scandal all shared the same marble facade. The Medici family ruled it not by title but by wealth, the most reliable crown of all. They funded painters, philosophers, and occasionally their own exiles. Florence was also full of courtesans, though here, they moved through quieter channels. The city was smaller, more intimate, less forgiving of gossip. And yet gossip was the only currency everyone had. The Florentine courtesan wasn't necessarily a celebrity like those in Venice or Rome. She was more like a well-placed whisper, powerful if you knew where to listen. Many were educated in convents before changing professions. That was a very Renaissance path for a woman, from pious silence to strategic conversation. The Medici courts were full of unofficial advisors, women who could charm a duke while pretending not to understand politics, which usually meant they understood it better than he did. It's hard to find their names, of course. Chroniclers rarely recorded the clever women who changed men's minds. They were companions, muses, confidants, words that mean influence, carefully disguised as decoration. One of them, Alessandra Scala, started as a scholar's daughter, fluent in Greek and Latin, tutored by humanists who thought she'd make a fine example of feminine learning, as long as she didn't overdo it. She overdid it. She debated with famous thinkers and wrote elegant letters that made half the male scholars of Florence profoundly uncomfortable. When she married, her husband politely asked her to stop writing. Naturally, she obeyed. And just as naturally, her letters continued to circulate in secret. Florence produced women like her constantly, too educated to stay silent, too intelligent to fit into the narrow outlines drawn for them. For some, becoming a courtesan offered a strange form of liberation. At least it was honest. There was no pretense of virtue, the deal was clear. And within that clarity, there was room to breathe. These women attended salons where men read their poetry aloud and then pretended they'd written it themselves. They were patrons of music, philosophy, and theater. The cultural life of Florence often owed more to them than to the noblemen whose names filled the marble plaques. Still, their freedom was always conditional. Too visible, and you became scandal. Too discreet, and you disappeared. The balance required more finesse than diplomacy, and perhaps more courage. Because Florence, for all its refinement, was still medieval underneath. When a courtesan fell out of favor, there was no safety net. The same men who had toasted her brilliance one evening might condemn her for vanity the next. Reputation was both armor and noose. Yet some managed to rise far beyond their origins. In the Medici orbit, a woman named Imperia Cognati became a kind of urban legend. She was a Roman courtesan, but Florence loved her stories. She was known as La Divina Imperia, the Divine Imperia, and that nickname tells you everything about Renaissance irony. She was praised for her wit, adored for her beauty, and mocked for daring to charge accordingly. Imperia's salons were said to attract popes, poets, and ambassadors. She dressed like a goddess because her clients expected it, but her letters reveal a biting humor. She once complained that her lovers were as generous in compliments as they are frugal in payment. She died mysteriously, poison, perhaps self-inflicted, perhaps not. The records disagree. The moralists, of course, claimed divine punishment. But others whispered that she'd simply grown tired of the performance. Her death caused Rome to panic for about a week. Then it went back to its usual routine, confession in the morning, sin by sunset. Let's pause for a breath here. If you're half asleep already, that's fine. That's the right state of mind for Renaissance gossip. It was never meant to be consumed awake. Now, back to Rome, the city that couldn't decide whether it was holy or hedonistic. By the 1520s, the papal court had become one of Europe's strangest stages. The Pope ruled from the Vatican, surrounded by paintings of angels and cardinals who behaved like opera characters. There were banquets with gold plates, tournaments in St. Peter's Square, and rumor has it, the occasional masquerade where even the Holy Fathers joined in, though, naturally, under heavy masks. It was in this theatrical Rome that women like Fiammetta Michaelis flourished. Fiammetta was known as the courtesan of the cardinals, though not because she was pious. She was one of the first to understand that information, not beauty, was the real source of power. Her salon became a kind of informal news agency. She heard everything. Ambassadors, poets, even spies dropped by under the pretext of conversation. By the end of an evening, she knew who owed whom, who envied whom, and what scandal would erupt next. It's likely that popes themselves read her gossip second-hand, disguised as reports. If Renaissance intelligence networks had a feminine face, it was hers. Another woman, Julia Farnese, took the role further. She was mistress to Pope Alexander VI, the infamous Rodrigo Borgia. Julia was barely 17 when she entered his circle. She was supposed to be a political pawn, married off to secure her brother's advancement. Instead, she became the Pope's obsession. Painters called her Julia la Bella, and artists immortalized her as the Virgin Mary in altarpieces, which the Church pretended not to notice. Through Julia, her family rose to immense power. Her brother Alessandro became a cardinal and later Pope Paul III. Her influence was undeniable, even if history tried to write her off as merely decorative. You see, that's the strange duality of power through intimacy. It's invisible in the records but unmistakable in the results. The courtesans of Italy didn't issue decrees or command armies, but they often determined who did. They weren't queens, but they practiced a quieter kind of statecraft. One conversation, one favor, one carefully delayed letter could shift alliances more effectively than 1,000 soldiers. And perhaps that's why male historians, for centuries, preferred to call them dangerous. The Renaissance night deepens. The candles burn low, and the whispers of those forgotten women drift gently toward sleep. The Renaissance never stayed still. Like perfume in a crowded room, it drifted, carried by merchants, painters, letters, and rumors. And as the ideas moved north, so did the women who knew how to wield them. By the early 1500s, France was the new stage. The wars between Italy and France had brought artists, soldiers, and scholars across the Alps. Among them were courtesans, women who understood that where power moved, opportunity followed. The French court was fascinated by Italy. It wanted the art, the manners, the sophistication, the beautiful corruption. France imported painters from Florence, architects from Rome, and, quietly, women who could teach kings how to act like Renaissance men. Paris at that time was half medieval, half modern. Narrow streets filled with mud and merchants sat just beyond courtyards of exquisite marble. In those courtyards, conversation was everything. The French nobility prided itself on elegance, but it was the courtesans who defined what elegance meant. One of the first to leave her mark was a woman named Ninon de l'Enclos. Though she technically belonged to the next century, her world was born from this one. Ninon was educated, witty, and famously disinterested in marriage. She kept a salon where philosophers and poets came not to flirt, but to learn the art of conversation itself. But before Ninon came her predecessors, women like Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II. Diane wasn't called a courtesan officially. That word was too Italian, too scandalous, but her role was almost identical. She was 36 when Henry, barely 15, fell hopelessly in love with her. And here's the fascinating part, she didn't encourage him. Not immediately. She waited. She made him prove devotion through discipline, through restraint, through study. Diane's power was subtle, shaped through patience. She dressed in black and white to appear timeless, rode horses better than most men, and controlled her influence like an art form. When Henry became king, he placed her initials beside his on royal palaces. His queen, Catherine de' Medici, endured it with icy calculation. 4 decades, Diane governed France in all but name. Ambassadors bowed to her, artists painted for her, even the church approached her cautiously. Yet she never called herself powerful. That was the brilliance. She ruled without admitting she ruled. In her letters, she wrote about loyalty, aging, and the art of dignity, ideas that would echo for centuries in how women performed influence under scrutiny. Around her, a whole culture of refined mistresses developed. The French word maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress, became practically an institution. Each king had one, recognized by court etiquette. They hosted balls, advised on politics, and decided who gained audience with the throne. And beneath the royal mistresses came a constellation of lesser-known courtesans, singers, poets, dancers, who filled the salons of Paris with conversation and gossip that carried more weight than any royal decree. At night, the city glittered with light and danger. Candles glowed in glass chandeliers, masks hid identities, and ideas, forbidden or revolutionary, slipped between glasses of wine. The courtesans became both witnesses and participants in the shaping of early modern thought. Because it wasn't only beauty they offered. It was listening. Men, especially powerful men, rarely had that luxury. They were surrounded by sycophants, not equals. The courtesans became their mirrors, calm, intelligent, and dangerous, because they could see them clearly. There's a saying from that era. Every great man has a woman who makes him believe he is wise. No one knew that better than the courtesans of France. Meanwhile, in Venice and Rome, their Italian sisters watched with curiosity, some jealous, others inspired. The profession was evolving. It was no longer just about seduction or patronage. It was about diplomacy, information, survival. Letters passed across borders, written in code, scented with perfume, folded like secrets. Through those letters, courtesans connected courts across Europe. They introduced artists to patrons, carried messages between kings, and sometimes changed the course of wars with a whisper. Take, for instance, Tullia di Aragona, poet, philosopher, and courtesan of Florence. Her works on the nature of love were read not just in Italy but in France and Spain. She wrote of passion not as sin, but as a kind of divine intelligence. For her, love was reason illuminated, a radical thought for a world ruled by male theologians. Her influence stretched far beyond her salon. French humanists read her essays and adapted them, blending Italian sensuality with French intellect. Slowly, the idea of the femme savante, the learned woman, began to emerge. By the late 1500s, France was dotted with salons run by women of wit rather than birth. They weren't necessarily courtesans in the old sense, but the lineage was clear. They had inherited the courtesan's confidence, their control of conversation, their ability to turn intellect into influence. If the Renaissance had a quiet revolution, this was it, women claiming space not through rebellion, but through refinement. Still, not everyone admired them. Moralists raged, preachers thundered, pamphlets accused them of corrupting France. Yet the same critics attended their salons in secret, drawn by the elegance they publicly condemned. There's something beautifully human in that contradiction, the eternal struggle between what society praises and what it desires. Let's pause again here. Imagine the setting, a Parisian chamber, tapestries glowing by candlelight, perfume thick in the air. A woman reclines on a velvet couch, her hair adorned with pearls, her voice low but steady. Around her, men argue about philosophy. She listens, smiles, then says something so precise that the room falls silent. That silence, that perfect, weighted silence, is her victory. The Renaissance had begun with men painting women as muses. Now, women were writing themselves into history, even if the ink had to be hidden beneath metaphor. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England was taking notes. Henry VIII's court was its own drama, full of ambition and downfall. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, grew up watching how love could be both power and peril. When Elizabeth I became queen, she reversed the game entirely. She turned the courtesan's art into political armor. She never married, but she played the part of a woman desired by an entire nation. Courtiers called her the Virgin Queen, yet her flirtations were calculated acts of diplomacy. In her court, men competed for favor not with swords, but with poetry. She rewarded wit, not lineage. Sound familiar? It's the courtesan's salon reborn as government. Elizabeth adopted their greatest weapon, control of attention. She learned that gaze, charm, and distance could rule as effectively as armies. The courtesans had shown her that. By the early 1600s, the tradition had traveled everywhere, from the courts of Spain to the salons of Amsterdam. It had become a way of surviving a world that offered women no rightful power, turned charm into intellect, intellect into conversation, conversation into influence. It's easy to romanticize all this, of course. History tends to soften sharp edges. But behind the silks and perfumes were women who faced daily danger, of illness, exile, violence, or ruin. Theirs was not a life of leisure. It was a high-wire act performed without a net. And yet they walked it gracefully. They left behind letters, poems, songs, fragments of diaries, enough to prove that they saw the world clearly. They saw the absurdity of power, the fragility of reputation, and the comedy of men who called them temptresses while begging for their approval. There's an anonymous poem from the late 1500s, written in Italian, that captures it perfectly. It reads, "Men pay for our silence, yet fear our speech. They worship our beauty, then call it deceit. They name us danger, but it is they who tremble." It's unsigned, of course, but the voice is unmistakable, weary, intelligent, amused. You can almost hear her laughing as she writes it, candlelight flickering across the page. The courtesans of the Renaissance didn't invent feminism, but they practiced something close to its instinct, survival through self-definition. They built their own names, their own spaces, their own legacies, often at great cost. And in doing so, they taught Europe a dangerous lesson, that beauty combined with intelligence could move empires. Over time, their image would fade into legend. Painters turned them into allegories, vanity, love, temptation. But look closer at those paintings. The eyes aren't vain or naive. They're knowing. They're remembering something the world would rather forget. As centuries passed, the courtesan became a ghost in art and literature, haunting novels, operas, and plays. But beneath the fiction lies the truth. They were architects of modern culture, the first to live by their minds and their charm in equal measure. So tonight, as the world outside your window grows quiet, picture them once more. A candlelit room. The rustle of silk. The faint scent of ink and jasmine. A woman smiling at the edge of history, pen in hand, ready to write herself back into existence. Because in the end, that's what they did. They refused to disappear. And that's where we'll pause for tonight. In Part 4, we'll follow their legacy into the Age of Enlightenment, where their salons begin shaping philosophy, politics, and even revolutions. From whispered secrets to world-changing ideas, the courtesans will take one final step, from muses to makers of history. Until then, close your eyes. Let the voices fade, the candles dim, and the old world dissolve into dream. Sleep well, traveler of time. The Renaissance never stayed still. Like perfume in a crowded room, it drifted, carried by merchants, painters, letters, and gossip. And as ideas moved north, so did the women who understood how to use them. By the early 1500s, France became the next great stage. The wars between Italy and France had dragged artists, soldiers, and philosophers over the Alps, and among that wandering crowd came courtesans, women who understood that power had a way of changing its address. The French court wanted everything Italian, the art, the manners, the soft velvet corruption. France imported painters from Florence, architects from Rome, and quietly, women who could teach kings how to act like Renaissance men. Paris at the time was a contradiction, half mud, half marble. Its streets smelled of smoke and humanity, yet behind the grime stood courtyards filled with music and philosophy. Conversation ruled everything, and those who could charm with words gained more ground than soldiers could with swords. It was in these salons and chambers that the courtesan found a new role. She was no longer only a companion of pleasure, but a teacher of refinement. The French nobleman adored intelligence dressed as wit. The women who could blend the two became irreplaceable. One of the earliest stars of this world was Diane de Poitiers, mistress of King Henry II. She wasn't labeled a courtesan, that word was too foreign, too dangerous, but the difference was mostly one of semantics. Her relationship with Henry began when he was 15 and she was 36. In the modern sense, that would raise eyebrows, but in her world, it raised his status. Diane wasn't driven by lust or vanity. She understood that affection could be molded into authority. When Henry ascended the throne, she managed what few women ever could, to be loved by a king and respected by his court. His initials were carved beside hers on royal buildings. His queen, Catherine de' Medici, quietly tolerated it, because to fight Diane meant to fight Henry's will itself. It's worth pausing on Diane, because her control was remarkable. She ruled through patience. She rarely raised her voice. She dressed simply, wore her hair in a signature style, and maintained her beauty through rigorous discipline, early morning cold baths, horseback rides, moderation in food. She once said, "A woman's charm fades when her vanity grows," and somehow everyone believed her. Her power wasn't just erotic, it was psychological. She understood men's desire to be guided without realizing it. She made Henry feel wise when she was the one directing him. And when we look back, it's strange how many of these women built empires out of emotional intelligence centuries before anyone thought to give it a name. Around the same time, Italian courtesans were exchanging letters with their French sisters. Venice had Veronica Franco, poet and political survivor. Paris had Diane, mistress and stateswoman. Their words echoed across mountains, their stories whispered by men who thought they were gossiping but were, in fact, preserving history. Franco's poems reached France, translated quietly, passed between scholars and lovers. One line reads, "We are mirrors, not muses." It was an audacious claim, a quiet rebellion tucked inside rhyme. By the mid-1500s, the French court had turned courtesanship into a system. There was an official mistress, the maîtresse en titre, recognized almost like a government office. Ambassadors visited her, poets dedicated verses to her, and ministers negotiated through her. Behind her came a constellation of secondary favorites, singers, poets, dancers, women who lived by wit and observation. They gathered in salons, discussing politics disguised as poetry. The salons were the soft beating heart of French culture. They were candlelit havens where intellect met indulgence. A duke might debate Plato with a woman who could also quote Petrarch while adjusting her fan. The combination of intellect and allure became the new definition of sophistication. Courtesans used this setting like chess players use a board. They guided conversations, introduced patrons to artists, arranged marriages, and whispered into the right ears. They shaped taste, art, and sometimes policy, all while pretending to care only for laughter and poetry. If you closed your eyes and listened, you'd hear soft laughter, the scrape of a lute, and the rustle of silk. You'd never guess that the empire's gossip, diplomacy, and alliances were quietly orbiting around a woman reclining on a velvet couch. Some men despised this power. Pamphlets accused courtesans of witchcraft, the oldest trick in the book for explaining women who were simply smarter than their accusers. Others admired them secretly. A few fell in love and regretted it forever. There's something endlessly human in that cycle. Desire, fear, and fascination tangled like ivy around old stone. Among the later French figures, one woman stands out as a bridge between the Renaissance courtesan and the Enlightenment salonière, Ninon de l'Enclos. Born in 1620, she inherited everything her Italian predecessors had built, and polished it into philosophy. Ninon wasn't just a lover of men, she was a collector of minds. Her salon attracted playwrights, poets, scientists, and future philosophers. Molière, La Rochefoucauld, even the young Voltaire would later owe intellectual debts to her. She wrote about love as a discipline, something that could teach rationality. Her charm wasn't just beauty, it was composure. Men described her as calm even in argument, amused rather than offended. She once said, "I forgive men for thinking they rule, because it helps them sleep at night." That single sentence feels like the perfect summary of the courtesan's secret strength. They ruled indirectly, softly, invisibly, in a way the world could deny only by pretending not to notice. By Ninon's era, courtesans had blurred into philosophers. They were no longer merely companions but cultivators of ideas. Their salons became the birthplace of modern French conversation, that uniquely balanced blend of irony, intellect, and sensuality. In her later years, Ninon refused to grow bitter. She outlived almost everyone who had condemned her. When asked how she maintained her serenity, she answered, "I practiced not caring about fools." That may sound modern, but it was timeless advice from someone who had watched society's hypocrisy unfold for 6 decades. Still, her life wasn't without risk. The church exiled her for her independence. She went quietly, spent a few months away, and then returned to Paris, unrepentant, unbroken, slightly amused. Her friends welcomed her back with laughter. It's easy to imagine her now, an old woman with silver hair, sitting by a window, smiling at the irony that her ideas had survived while her critics' names had not. The story of these women is often painted as tragic, and yes, many faced loneliness, scandal, or exile. But tragedy isn't the right word. What they really lived was complexity. They navigated systems designed to erase them and somehow left fingerprints on the future. By the late Renaissance, the courtesan had become an archetype, immortalized in art, caricatured in sermons, mythologized in novels. The line between fiction and truth blurred, as it always does when power makes people uncomfortable. Painters like Titian and Tintoretto gave them immortal faces, though often under different names. Flora, Venus, the allegory of beauty, all these women share the same gaze, calm, intelligent, and faintly amused, as if they knew they'd been painted into eternity by men who barely understood them. Let's drift for a moment to Venice again, where the canals shimmered beneath moonlight and the courtesans of the city still held their salons. By now, they were legends, wealthy, educated, and paradoxically respectable in their disrepute. They received poets, diplomats, even cardinals, and discussed philosophy between love letters. One Venetian diarist wrote, "They speak with grace and learn with hunger." That hunger, for knowledge, for survival, for self-definition, was the thread that bound them all. It's strange to think that while wars and plagues ravaged Europe, these quiet gatherings shaped the future more than many battles did. Ideas about art, gender, love, and reason passed through their hands like cards in a deck. And what makes it all the more hypnotic is that they did this while appearing utterly effortless. Their power was designed to look like elegance, not resistance. But elegance can be a kind of rebellion too. Their legacy, though often erased, survived in the language of civility itself. Words like courtesy, grace, wit, all once associated with the courtesan's art of presence. And when you think about it, even today's idea of charm, that subtle fusion of confidence and empathy, has its roots in the candlelit parlors of these Renaissance women. They invented social rhythm. They taught the world that conversation could be art, that intellect could seduce, and that beauty without intelligence was simply decoration. Their tragedy, if we must call it that, was that history rarely credited them. Men wrote the books. Women like Diane, Veronica, and Ninon were left as footnotes, their achievements disguised as anecdotes. But in recent years, historians have been dusting off those margins. And what emerges is not scandal but strategy, a sophisticated understanding of how to survive in a system rigged against you, all while looking magnificent. Sometimes I imagine one of them looking out from her portrait, hearing us talk about her centuries later. I like to think she'd smile faintly and say, "It took you long enough." Because really, that's what history is, a delayed recognition of things women already knew. So as we close this part, picture the scene again. A candlelit salon, laughter floating through the air, books open on a table, a woman listening more than she speaks. Around her sit men convinced they're brilliant. She nods, offers one sentence, and changes the tone of the entire evening. That, right there, is mastery. And it's no wonder they terrified the church, confused kings, and fascinated artists. They were too graceful to be dismissed and too intelligent to be controlled. They were the Renaissance's most beautiful contradiction, both product and critic of their time. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, remember that behind every grand painting and every gilded palace, there was likely a quiet woman somewhere, writing letters, guiding men, and shaping culture in the shadows. What do you think? If you lived then, would you have joined those candlelit conversations, or preferred to listen quietly in a corner, the way we do now, across time? Tell me in the comments, after you've had a good night's sleep. For now, just rest. The world outside can wait. Let the candles burn low, and let the voices fade. Because in the next part, we'll drift into the Age of Enlightenment, where these women's legacy evolves into philosophy itself, and their salons begin to nurture the very thinkers who would question kings and crowns. But that's for another night. Sleep well, traveler. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's get comfortable again. Maybe dim the lights a little, pull your blanket up, and let's drift back together to the candlelit drawing rooms of 18th century Europe, where conversation was an art form, gossip was a weapon, and courtesans ruled not from thrones, but from velvet armchairs. Because tonight, we're wandering into the age of the salon, the elegant halfway point between the decadence of Renaissance pleasure and the calculated wit of Enlightenment society. It's strange, really, the Enlightenment was supposed to be about reason, progress, and rational debate. Philosophers wrote endless treatises on liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Yet somehow, the most powerful minds of the age kept finding themselves gathered in rooms decorated with silk wallpaper, sipping chocolate from porcelain cups, while listening to a woman who technically wasn't welcome in polite society. Tell them what to think. The irony of reason, being guided by desire, was not lost on anyone. Let's start in Paris, because of course we do. Paris, where the salons sparkled brighter than the chandeliers that hung over them. The most famous of them all was run by a woman who began, Quite literally, with nothing but her charm, Jean Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour. She had no noble blood, no official title, and no family fortune to ease her way into court. What she did have was a calm smile, flawless handwriting, and a very strategic understanding of human vanity. Jean caught the eye of King Louis XV around 1745, though "caught" might be too delicate a word. It was more of an orchestrated campaign. Friends arranged for her carriage to appear on the king's hunting routes. Her dresses were timed perfectly with the colors of the season, and the colors of his boredom. By the time he met her, she was already the image of his next obsession. The transformation was complete. The daughter of a tax farmer became the official mistress of France. She even received a title, the Marquise de Pompadour, and her job, more or less, was to make a depressed monarch feel important again. Now, she did that, of course. But she also did much more. Pompadour didn't just survive at court, she curated it. She became patroness to artists, playwrights, and philosophers. Voltaire, the great wit of the Enlightenment, was one of her admirers, though naturally he couched his flattery in irony. Under her guidance, France embraced Rococo art, all pastel nymphs and airy curls, a style that was simultaneously frivolous and controlled, much like her own persona. The fascinating part is that Jean managed all this while her relationship with the king quietly changed. After a few years, she was no longer his romantic interest. But she stayed by his side as friend, confidant, and political advisor, which, in 18th-century Europe, was not something an ex-mistress usually did. She was the first to prove that charm could evolve into power, and that power could outlast affection. But Pompadour wasn't alone. Across Europe, a quiet army of intelligent, unmarried, occasionally scandalous women were hosting gatherings where politics, philosophy, and literature blended with flirtation and candlelight. These were the salons, places where courtesans, noblewomen, and ambitious thinkers could meet as supposed equals, at least for an evening. In these rooms, the atmosphere was carefully controlled. A successful salonier knew exactly how to balance ego. Too many noble guests, and the thinkers would feel like performers. Too many writers, and the nobles would feel intellectually exposed. The hostess guided conversation like a soft-spoken conductor, never lecturing, but gently steering. She could make or unmake reputations with a single comment disguised as a compliment. Madame Geoffrin, one of the earliest saloniers, famously hosted dinners where painters and philosophers mixed with ministers and diplomats. She wasn't beautiful. In fact, one guest called her alarmingly plain, but she possessed a serenity that made everyone else seem slightly foolish in comparison. She managed to keep order even among philosophers, which is about as easy as herding caffeinated cats. Salons were often dismissed by male writers as frivolous or decadent, yet they served as testing grounds for new ideas, sometimes literally. Denis Diderot, the philosopher behind the Encyclopédie, tested drafts of his articles by reading them aloud to salon audiences. If the ladies smiled, the idea had charm. If they frowned, he rewrote. One could argue that a good portion of Enlightenment thought was focus-grouped by courtesans before it reached the printing press. In Venice, meanwhile, the tradition took on its own flavor. Venetian courtesans had always blurred the line between sensuality and intellect. By the 1700s, women like Caterina Dolfin turned that blend into high art. Dolfin was witty, sharp, and financially independent, a rare trifecta. She published poetry, entertained ambassadors, and engaged in love affairs that were less about passion and more about diplomacy. Her gatherings were notorious for conversations that began with politics and ended in philosophy, or perhaps the other way around, depending on the wine. One of the most famous visitors to these salons was, inevitably, Giacomo Casanova. Contrary to his later reputation, Casanova wasn't just a seducer. He was also a restless mind, drawn to women who challenged him intellectually. His memoirs mention Dolfin with a kind of uneasy respect, as though he wasn't entirely sure whether she'd outwitted him. She probably had. The courtesans of the Enlightenment discovered that wit was a safer weapon than beauty. Beauty faded, or could be rivaled. But intellect, polished with charm and restraint, offered something more enduring. They learned to speak in riddles of reason, to veil criticism as compliment, and to outmaneuver men who underestimated them. Some became advisors to princes. Others became ghostwriters for politicians. A few even shaped treaties. And nearly all did it from rooms filled with laughter, candlelight, and the faint scent of fading roses. As we drift further through this candlelit century, the atmosphere begins to change. The Enlightenment, for all its talk of equality, was still a man's game. Courtesans had influence, yes, but rarely recognition. The salon was their kingdom, but it was also a gilded cage. Many of them lived in constant anxiety over age, reputation, or the whims of their patrons. They performed intellect as much as they performed charm, aware that one wrong remark could end their reign overnight. Still, what a reign it was! Madame du Defa, for instance, continued to host some of the most sought-after gatherings in Paris well into her 70s, and she did so while nearly blind. Her letters to Horace Walpole remain among the sharpest documents of the age. She was witty, cynical, and allergic to pretense. When she described a fashionable philosopher as a candle that thinks itself a sun, you can almost hear the delicate clink of teacups around her table. There's something almost meditative about these women, their restraint, their endless balancing act. They lived within rules and yet constantly bent them. They couldn't vote, legislate, or lead armies, so they learned to shape conversation instead. The salon was their parliament. And in a way, it was far more enduring. Armies disband, parliaments dissolve. But an idea whispered by candlelight, that has a tendency to linger. As the century wore on, the line between courtesan and intellectual grew ever thinner. Some salonières were titled ladies, others were actresses, a few were women of the half-world, the polite term for those whose morals were flexible but whose taste was impeccable. What united them wasn't background, but presence. They knew how to fill a room, softly, gracefully, without raising their voices. Imagine, for a moment, one of those evenings. The candles are burning low. A small harpsichord plays something slow and melancholy in the corner. Voltaire is arguing with Rousseau, naturally, because that's what philosophers did for sport. Across the room, a duchess is whispering to a young diplomat who's pretending not to notice that his wig is slipping. And at the center, our hostess, perhaps Pompadour, perhaps du Defa, leans forward, eyes half closed, listening with that faint smile that says, "I'm not just hearing you, I'm shaping you." The beauty of the Enlightenment salon wasn't in its elegance, though there was plenty of that, but in its stillness. The world outside might have been noisy with revolutions and reforms, but inside, everything slowed down to the rhythm of human voices. It's no wonder that modern listeners find these stories soothing. They're reminders that influence doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers across centuries. Of course, the calm couldn't last forever. By the 1780s, Europe was on the brink of transformation again. The salons that once hosted philosophers would soon host conspiracies. The revolution was approaching, and it had little patience for powdered wigs or witty conversation. Many of the women who had once guided kings would find themselves quietly retreating to country estates, or worse, facing accusations of decadence. The salon, symbol of refined debate, was suddenly suspect. Madame de Staël, one of the last great salonières, tried to keep the spirit alive in the early 19th century. She was fiercely intelligent, politically outspoken, and, inconveniently for her safety, unafraid to criticize Napoleon. He exiled her from Paris. She turned exile into productivity, writing thick books that combined philosophy, gossip, and travelogue, the spiritual descendants of the conversations that once filled her living room. By then, the age of the courtesan philosopher was fading. Society was industrializing, moral standards were tightening, and salons began to seem like relics of a gentler, slower time. Still, their legacy lingered. Every modern talk show, every literary circle, every podcast where clever people trade ideas over laughter, all of them, in some quiet way, descend from those candlelit gatherings. And maybe that's what makes the story of the courtesans so quietly compelling. They began as ornaments of power, then became its interpreters, and finally its ghosts, remembered mostly for their laughter, yet responsible for much of the conversation that shaped the modern world. So, as we let our minds drift toward sleep, imagine yourself among them. The candles flicker, the conversation hums, the air smells faintly of wax and perfume. Someone reads a poem that makes no sense but sounds beautiful. And in that moment, you realize that influence doesn't always need a crown. Sometimes, it just needs good lighting and better timing. What about you? Would you have thrived in those rooms of wit and velvet, or preferred the quiet certainty of anonymity? Tell me in the comments what you think, once you've drifted back from this little journey. Let's rest our minds here for a moment. And next time, we'll drift gently into Part 5, when revolutions begin and the Age of Elegance finally meets its reckoning. Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you're settled in again. Maybe you've got a soft pillow behind your head. Maybe the lights are just low enough that everything feels a little blurry at the edges. Tonight, we're drifting into the late 18th century, a time when the chandeliers of Europe began to flicker, when kings started losing their heads, and courtesans had to decide whether to weep, adapt, or simply pretend not to notice. It's a strange thing to imagine, those elegant salons and candlelit boudoirs suddenly cast into the shadow of revolution. For decades, courtesans had reigned quietly, shaping conversation, guiding taste, whispering to power. But power was changing hands, violently. The Enlightenment's dreams of equality sounded noble on parchment, but equality wasn't great for anyone who'd built their influence on charm. Let's start in France, because France never disappoints when it comes to beautiful chaos. By the 1780s, Louis XV was long gone, Madame de Pompadour was a portrait on the wall, and Marie Antoinette had turned Versailles into a pastel fever dream. She had her own circle of favorites, many of them women of dubious background and dazzling taste. Some called them the Queen's inner court. Others called them parasites in pearls. Among them were women who had learned the arts of conversation and persuasion from the salons of the previous generation. They weren't courtesans in the open sense. The revolution had made that kind of luxury look indecent, but they used the same tools: elegance, intelligence, and a strategic understanding of attention. They designed gardens, managed theater productions, and threw parties that blurred the line between social event and political statement. It was all very sophisticated and very doomed, because, as we know, France was not in the mood for sophistication. By 1789, Paris was rumbling. Bread was scarce, pamphlets were vicious, and words like virtue and citizen started replacing grace and countess. The courtesans who had once entertained philosophers found themselves recast as symbols of decadence. Even women who had nothing to do with politics suddenly represented everything wrong with the old world. And yet, strangely enough, some courtesans adapted faster than anyone else. They'd always lived by their wits. Revolution was just a new kind of stage. Take Grace Dalrymple Elliot, for instance, a Scottish beauty who became one of the last glittering courtesans of pre-revolutionary Paris. She'd been mistress to the Prince of Wales in London before crossing the Channel to find fresh admirers. Her salon attracted diplomats, soldiers, and, inconveniently, spies. When the revolution began, she found herself entangled with both royalists and republicans, not out of ideology, but because she happened to like interesting people. Grace kept a journal through those years, and it reads like someone describing a dinner party that's slowly turning into an execution. She wrote calmly about soldiers marching past her windows, about friends disappearing, about the sound of distant mobs like ocean waves. Once, she hid an aristocrat in her home and nearly got herself arrested. When she was finally imprisoned, she endured it with the same dry humor that had once charmed princes. They were kind enough, she wrote of her jailers, though their manners could use improvement. Her story ended, miraculously, in survival. When so many lost their heads, Grace kept hers, both literally and figuratively. After her release, she retired quietly to the countryside, tending a small garden and outliving most of her former lovers. It's almost poetic, a courtesan surviving an empire by learning to enjoy silence. But others weren't so lucky. The revolution devoured its favorites as eagerly as it devoured its kings. Those who had once embodied wit and sensuality were now seen as reminders of waste and corruption. In the new republic, virtue was suddenly fashionable, but the definition of virtue was alarmingly narrow. Still, influence never disappears completely, it just changes form. When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power, France reinvented its elite class. The old aristocracy was gone, but in its place arose a new kind of court, filled with generals, bureaucrats, and their ambitious companions. And once again, courtesans found their niche. Napoleon himself wasn't particularly romantic. He was too busy conquering Europe and writing letters to Josephine that swung wildly between devotion and irritation. But his court adored spectacle. The empire needed glamour to disguise its militarism, and courtesans, or beauties of the Directoire, as they were now called, became unofficial ambassadors of that glamour. Women like Thérèse Tallien and Joséphine de Beauharnais defined the fashion of the era. Tallien, nicknamed Notre Dame de Thermidor, was a revolutionary icon, once imprisoned herself, then reborn as the queen of Parisian society. She hosted salons draped in gauze and incense, where guests dressed like Greco-Roman statues and danced barefoot in marble halls. It was all very refined, in a theatrical sort of way, a deliberate contrast to the years of blood and austerity that had come before. Therese wasn't technically a courtesan, but she moved through the same world, one where charm could become currency. She had lovers who were generals, diplomats, and financiers, and she used those connections to secure safety and status. In a letter, one admirer wrote that she reigned over Paris by beauty and over France by benevolence, which is a very elegant way of saying she knew how to network better than anyone else. Her friend Josephine was, of course, even more successful. Born a minor Creole noblewoman from Martinique, she spent her early life navigating debt, scandal, and social exile. But her calm voice and soft manners could melt even the most ambitious heart, including Napoleon's. She married him when he was still just an ambitious general, and for a time, she became Empress of France. Not bad for a woman once mocked as a colonial widow with good ankles. Josephine transformed the imperial court into a theater of charm. She filled it with flowers, artists, and musicians, turning cold marble halls into something almost human. She was kind to servants, polite to enemies, and, when necessary, quietly manipulative. Napoleon might have conquered continents, but Josephine conquered the French imagination. Even after he divorced her for failing to produce an heir, she remained adored. People said she haunted his dreams, which is rather poetic, though probably annoying for his second wife. Elsewhere in Europe, the story was much the same. Monarchies collapsed and reformed, but wherever power existed, there were always women who understood its subtler languages: gesture, presence, the slow drip of attention. In Vienna, the surviving Habsburgs tried to rebuild their dignity with balls and concerts. In London, actresses like Harriet Wilson became celebrities simply by refusing to be quiet. She once threatened to publish the love letters of her aristocratic clients unless they paid her to keep them secret. Most of them did. Those who didn't found their private lives suddenly available at any good bookshop. Harriet's memoirs, published in 1825, scandalized polite society and delighted everyone else. They're not literature, exactly. More a running commentary of irony and survival. "I never could understand," she wrote, "why people who sin together are so shocked to find themselves described together." There's a kind of weary wisdom in that line, the voice of a woman who had seen reputations rise and fall with the same inevitability as the seasons. By the early 19th century, Europe had entered its long mourning after the Restoration period. The wars were over, the emperors exiled, and everyone was pretending to be respectable again. But respectability is a fragile thing, easily bored. Behind the heavy curtains of polite drawing rooms, the courtesan tradition persisted, older, subtler, disguised as friendship or patronage. Some of the most influential women of this era didn't call themselves courtesans at all. They were widows, hostesses, or confidantes. They managed estates, financed artists, or advised politicians. Yet their methods were the same: patience, empathy, and an uncanny ability to make powerful men believe they were the clever ones. One of my favorites from this period is Countess Marie Waluska, a Polish noblewoman who became Napoleon's mistress during his campaigns in Eastern Europe. The relationship began as a political move. Polish leaders hoped her influence could secure Napoleon's support for their independence. But somewhere along the way, it turned unexpectedly tender. Napoleon, usually cold and calculating, seemed genuinely fond of her. He called her his Polish wife, though he already had one of those in France. Marie never flaunted her position, never demanded titles or jewels. She just stood beside him, quietly, as history rearranged itself around them. After his fall, she returned to Poland and raised their son alone. She never wrote scandalous memoirs, never sought publicity. When she died, she was buried with both her husband's and Napoleon's initials engraved together, a modest final statement of complicated loyalties. There's something beautifully human in that, a reminder that even in a world built on strategy and survival, affection sometimes slips through the cracks. Through all these centuries, the courtesan's art evolved from seduction to subtlety. What began in the painted chambers of Renaissance Venice became a kind of diplomacy by candlelight. By the 19th century, it was less about lovers and more about legacy, about knowing when to speak, when to smile, and when silence could do the most damage. And as always, Society had a love-hate relationship with these women. They were adored, then condemned, then quietly imitated. Moralists denounced them in pamphlets while wives copied their hairstyles. Writers mocked them, then fell hopelessly in love. And history, that distracted chronicler, tried to forget them, but couldn't quite manage it. So as we rest here, halfway between empire and exile, between powdered wigs and industrial smog, maybe we can appreciate the strange grace of their survival. The world kept changing, violently, absurdly, but they adapted. They understood something the kings never did, that power is never permanent, but presence lingers. What about you? If you'd lived through those shifting years, would you have chased love, power, or peace? Tell me down below, when you wake, what you think. Now let's drift onward, softly, into part 6, where we'll follow the courtesans who stepped onto the grandest news stage of all, the 19th century, with its glittering opera houses, smoky boulevards, and the quiet melancholy of modern love. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's take a deep breath and drift forward now, through time. The candles of the 18th century flicker and fade, replaced by the warm orange glow of gaslight. Outside, you can hear the distant hum of carriages and the sigh of steam engines. It's the 19th century, a world of opera houses, gossip columns, and too many rules pretending to keep people moral. And yet, some things don't change. There are still women who live just outside the boundaries of respectability, dazzling the respectable from a safe distance. Only now, they have an audience far larger than any court could provide. Because in this new industrialized age, everything, even charm, can be commodified. Let's begin in Paris, again, because where else? Paris was the capital of everything that glittered. Napoleon's empire had crumbled, kings had come and gone, and the city was reinventing itself yet again. The streets were wider, the boulevards brighter, and the social hierarchy as confused as ever. Money could buy almost anything now: art, comfort, even a little dignity. But true distinction, the kind that made you unforgettable, still belonged to the courtesans. They weren't called courtesans anymore, of course. That word had become a little old-fashioned. The French preferred demi-mondaine, literally, woman of the half-world. Not quite society, not quite scandal. Somewhere in between. These women lived on the border between luxury and exile, admired and condemned in equal measure. The most famous of them all was Lepeva, born Esther Lachman, in a poor Jewish family in Moscow. She arrived in Paris with almost nothing, which, for a determined woman in 1840s France, meant only that she had a good story ahead of her. She worked her way up from seamstress to mistress to legend. By her 30s, she was one of the most visible women in Europe, known for her diamonds, her wit, and her ability to make even the most powerful men wait. Lepeva built herself a palace on the Champs-Élysées, the Hôtel de Lepeva, complete with onyx bathtubs, gilded staircases, and murals of mythological goddesses who all looked suspiciously like her. Guests were expected to remove their gloves before touching the railings, just to feel the texture of polished marble. It was less a home and more a work of self-promotion, a temple to survival through beauty. Her lovers included princes, industrialists, and poets. But she wasn't sentimental. She negotiated like a banker and dressed like a dream. Once, when asked whether she ever regretted her choices, she replied, "I would have liked to be virtuous, but it costs too much." The courtesans of this age were masters of branding before branding existed. They understood image, how to walk into a room, how to pause just long enough for the conversation to shift in their favor. They cultivated rumors like gardeners tending roses. And they invested their profits wisely. Many of them bought property, art, or even shares in railroads. For a society that mocked their morals, it was amusing how often it relied on their money. Let's drift over now to another name, Cora Pearl, the English courtesan who conquered Paris during the Second Empire. She had a sharp tongue, a fondness for absurd luxury, and a habit of dyeing her hair in pastel shades long before that was fashionable. Her parties were legendary. Once, she made a dramatic entrance at a banquet carried in on a silver platter, wearing nothing but a sprinkling of diamonds and a confident expression. Cora didn't care much for reputation. "I liked pleasure," she wrote in her memoirs, "and I took it where I could find it." She was, in her own way, refreshingly modern, pragmatic, unashamed, and deeply aware of her expiration date in a world obsessed with youth. When her fortunes declined, she accepted it calmly. "The world turns," she wrote. It has to, or we'd all fall off. Behind the glamour, though, there was always melancholy. These women lived surrounded by adoration, but it was rarely love in the steady sense. Their relationships were performances, flattering, strategic, and fleeting. Many of them retired early, quietly, before the spotlight could fade on its own. Others tried to reinvent themselves as artists, actresses, or philanthropists. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Still, the courtesan's allure fascinated writers of the time. Alexandre Dumas Fils wrote La Dame aux Camélias, the story of a tragic courtesan named Marguerite Gautier who dies of consumption, beautiful, misunderstood, and repentant, of course. The novel became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring La Traviata, the opera by Verdi. Suddenly, courtesans were no longer just scandals. They were symbols of doomed love, draped in lace and moral ambiguity. It's funny, isn't it? Society could never quite decide whether to adore or condemn them, so it did both. It worshipped their beauty while insisting they suffer for it by the final act. And audiences wept, safely, from their theater seats, before going home to criticize real women for being less tragic. If you listen closely, though, you can almost hear the courtesans laughing. Because they understood the performance better than anyone. They knew that pity could be just another form of power. Let's drift across Europe for a moment. In London, the atmosphere was less forgiving. Victorian England had perfected the art of hypocrisy, moral on the outside, deeply curious underneath. Courtesans were both condemned and celebrated, often in the same sentence. The city's gossip sheets couldn't get enough of them. One of the most famous was Lola Montez, born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, reinvented as a Spanish dancer and eventually mistress to King Ludwig I of Bavaria. She caused a national scandal, introduced progressive reforms, and inspired riots, all within about 2 years. Ludwig adored her until the entire country demanded she be exiled. She later toured America giving lectures titled Beauty and Morals, which was perhaps her boldest performance yet. Then there was Catherine Walters, known as Skittles. She was a courtesan of unusual discretion. She dressed modestly, rode horses better than most men, and managed her finances like a statesman. She avoided scandal by refusing to talk, which, in gossip-driven London, made her irresistible. Everyone wanted to know what she wasn't saying. When she finally retired, she lived quietly on her investments and outlived most of her lovers. There's something poetic about that, the woman everyone talked about spending her last years in silence. These 19th-century courtesans lived during a strange moment in history. The old world of aristocracy was fading, but women were still denied most forms of independence. So they created their own kind of freedom, even if it came at a cost. They used wit as armor, charm as currency, and reputation as both shield and weapon. Their presence reshaped culture in subtle ways. Fashion houses courted their approval. Painters like Manet and Toulouse-Lautrec painted them not as saints or sinners, but as modern women, self-possessed, aware, alive. Edouard Manet's Olympia scandalized viewers because its subject, modeled after the courtesan Victorine Meurent, stared straight back at the viewer, not ashamed, not seduced, just unbothered. It was the first modern gaze in Western art, and it belonged to a courtesan. In literature, too, their influence lingers. Balzac, Flaubert, Maupassant, all wrote about the demimonde, often with a mix of admiration and warning. They portrayed courtesans as reflections of modern society itself, seductive, materialistic, and deeply uncertain. And maybe that's why these stories feel strangely timeless. Beneath all the perfume and lace, they're about survival, about people finding small freedoms in unfair worlds. As the century rolled on, the courtesans began to fade from public life. Photography made privacy impossible. Newspapers turned gossip into industry. The modern celebrity was born, and with it came new kinds of scrutiny. The mystique that had once surrounded women like La Pava and Cora Pearl began to dissolve under the bright light of publicity. By 1900, Paris had a new kind of queen, the actress, the chanteuse, the fashion icon. But if you looked closely, you could still see traces of the courtesan's lineage, the carefully crafted persona, the performance of confidence, the ability to command attention without ever seeming to ask for it. It's tempting to see this as the end of an era. But perhaps it was just another transformation. The courtesan had always been a mirror of her time, reflecting its desires, its hypocrisies, its contradictions. And in the industrial age, What society desired most was an illusion, of glamour without guilt, of passion without consequence. So maybe the courtesans didn't vanish at all. Maybe they just changed costumes, trading satin for spotlight, opera boxes for film reels. Every celebrity interview, every carefully staged romance, every scandal managed to perfection, it all traces back, in some quiet way, to those women who once learned how to turn charm into survival. As the lights dim on the 19th century, we can almost hear the faint echo of their laughter, amused, knowing, neither bitter nor regretful. They lived on their own terms, in a world that offered them very few. And that, in the end, might be the closest thing to freedom any of them ever found. So let's rest here for a moment, between centuries. Imagine the rustle of silk fading into the hiss of steam, the city glowing under gaslight, and the whisper of distant applause. The courtesans are stepping off the stage now, leaving behind perfume, letters, and a few stubborn myths. Would you have admired them or judged them? Maybe both, as most people did. Tell me in the comments what you think, once you wake. The 20th century begins quietly. There's no fanfare, no clean line where one age ends and another begins. Just the slow turning of time, the shuffling of skirts into shorter shapes, the music changing from violins to jazz. The courtesans, those queens of charm and scandal, are still here, but their world is shrinking, and they can feel it. You can almost imagine the scene. Paris, 1905. The gaslights still burn, but electric lamps are starting to hum. The air smells of perfume and smoke. In a grand apartment overlooking the Boulevard Haussmann, a woman named Liane de Pogy is writing in her diary. She used to be one of the most famous courtesans in France, a dancer at the Folies Bergère, mistress to princes and writers, inspiration for novels. Now, she sits in her room, staring at her reflection in a mirror framed with gold leaf, and wonders how long beauty can survive modernity. Everything is changing, she writes. Even desire feels mechanical now. That's the quiet tragedy of the 20th century. The courtesans, who once ruled through mystery and conversation, now live in a world that prefers photographs and headlines. The age of personal charm is being replaced by the age of publicity. In Liane's time, fame still carried a trace of elegance. But soon, it will belong to the movies, to faces projected 30 feet high in dark rooms. The courtesan, once a private dream, is about to become a public fantasy. Liane de Pogy tried to adapt. She published her own novel, Idle Saphique, a semi-autobiographical story about love between women, daring for 1901, scandalous even in Paris. She continued to host lavish dinners, pose for photographers, and reinvent herself as needed. But inside, she felt the shift. The applause she once commanded with her presence could now be bought by anyone with a camera and a smile. One day, years later, she met a woman named Annie de Portales, a devout Christian, and something inside her changed. Liane began to drift away from the glittering half-world she'd once ruled. By 1920, she had retired from public life, entered a convent, and became Sister Anne-Marie. The woman who had once been the living embodiment of desire spent her last years praying quietly in Lausanne. She wrote, "I have spent my life in noise. Now I want silence." It's a strange, tender ending. Maybe inevitable. Every generation invents its own kind of escape. But the story doesn't end with her. In Italy, another woman walks into history wearing diamonds and defiance. La Belle Otero, born Augustina Otero Iglesias. She grew up poor in Spain, ran away from home as a teenager, and danced her way into the hearts of kings. In the 1890s and early 1900s, she was the most famous courtesan in Europe. Her lovers included Edward VII of England, the Tsar of Russia, and countless aristocrats who mistook her laughter for affection. La Belle Otero understood performance. She once said, "Men have paid me for their own dreams." She performed at the Folies Bergère, became an early celebrity before the word truly existed, and inspired portraits, jewelry, even rumors of duels fought over her honor. But when she finally retired, she was alone. Her fortune, once immense, slipped away in gambling and bad investments. By the time she died in 1965, she was living quietly in a small hotel in Nice, surrounded by faded photographs and memories of a century that had already forgotten her name. When a journalist asked if she regretted her life, she smiled softly and said, "No. I lived like a queen, even if it was only for a moment." That's the thread running through all their stories, the pursuit of a fleeting kind of immortality, not through virtue or titles, but through impact. through the art of being remembered, even for a little while. Meanwhile, the world around them was unraveling and rebuilding itself. Wars came. Empires fell. And the spaces where courtesans once reigned, the salons, the theaters, the drawing rooms, were replaced by nightclubs, cinemas, and the faint buzz of radio voices. The rules of desire were changing. By the 1920s, women were claiming independence in other ways, working, voting, creating. The flapper replaced the courtesan as the symbol of modern femininity. Short hair, short skirts, long nights. But this time, it wasn't about seducing power. It was about having it. Still, echoes of the courtesan lingered in the culture. You can see her in Mata Hari, the Dutch dancer who became infamous during World War I, exotic, mysterious, accused of espionage, executed by firing squad. Her legend was shaped by the same fascination that once surrounded La Pava or Cora Pearl, the dangerous woman, beautiful and unknowable. You can hear her voice, too, in the early songs of Edith Piaf, in the melancholy of Greta Garbo, in the way Hollywood constructed its first stars, luminous, tragic, untouchable. The courtesan had become myth, translated into film and melody. And maybe that was always her destiny, to dissolve into art. Let's pause for a moment and imagine one of them, not a famous one, just an ordinary woman caught in that twilight between centuries. She sits by a window in 1910, watching the automobiles rattle down the street. She used to host dinners that made men argue and poets write. Now she watches young women walk by in ankle-length dresses, unchaperoned, laughing freely. For a moment, she feels both envy and pride. She knows she helped make this freedom possible, not through speeches or laws, but by proving, in her own quiet way, that a woman could live without belonging to anyone. The 20th century moved too fast for her kind. What once took decades to build, reputation, mystique, connection, could now be created overnight and destroyed just as quickly. The world no longer had patience for slow seductions. Everything became instant, visible, consumable. The courtesan's greatest weapon, mystery, no longer had a place in a world obsessed with exposure. And yet, in every era, someone still carries the spark. Think of the great performers of the mid-century: Marlene Dietrich, Josephine Baker, Marilyn Monroe. Each of them, in their own way, inherited the courtesan's art, the ability to hold a gaze, to turn desire into identity, to rule without seeming to try. Josephine Baker, especially, embodied that power with grace. She danced barefoot, wore feathers and pearls, and made entire audiences forget the boundaries of race, class, and propriety. But she also worked for the French Resistance, adopted children from around the world, and demanded equality long before it was fashionable. Like the courtesans before her, she knew that charm could be a weapon, but she aimed it at something bigger. By the time the century reached its midpoint, the courtesan as a profession was gone. But as an idea, as an archetype, she was everywhere. In novels, films, fashion, and even politics, the art of allure had become a universal language. The women of the past had taught the world how to see femininity as performance, and how to use that performance to survive. But it's also true that their legacy carries a shadow. For every courtesan who thrived, there were countless others forgotten, consumed by the same system that adored them. Theirs was never a simple freedom. It was always fragile, dependent on beauty, youth, and the whims of men. And that's what makes their stories haunting. They were both empowered and trapped, symbols of liberation and proof of its limits. If you walk through Paris today, some of their traces still remain. The Hôtel de la Pava still stands on the Champs-Élysées, its marble staircase gleaming under soft light. In certain cafés, you can still see old photographs framed in gold, faces half smiling, names half remembered. Tourists pass by without noticing. But if you linger long enough, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of laughter, the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal glasses. They were never truly erased, just transformed into something the world couldn't quite name anymore. And perhaps that's fitting. The courtesans had always lived between definitions, between virtue and sin, art and survival, love and transaction. Even in disappearance, they remain in between. The 21st century has its own kind of courtesan, though the word feels too old now. She exists online, on screens, on stages. She crafts her image, cultivates her audience, performs her life. Fame and affection blur again, just as they did in Paris 100 years ago. But the currency has changed. Now it's likes, follows, and attention instead of diamonds or titles. The methods are new. The pattern is ancient. Maybe that's why we keep returning to these stories, not just for the scandal or the glamour, but because they reveal something uncomfortably human. The desire to be seen. The fear of being forgotten. The art of building meaning out of admiration. As the night grows quieter, let's look back one last time, past the neon lights, the film reels, the grand hotels, all the way to the candlelit chambers of Renaissance Italy, where this story began. There, centuries ago, a woman like Veronica Franco wrote poems about love and survival, about beauty as both blessing and burden. She probably never imagined that her voice would echo across time, that generations later, people would still whisper her name in fascination. But that's the strange gift of the courtesan's legacy. It teaches us that history doesn't just belong to kings and wars and inventions. It also belongs to those who lived by charm, by courage, by wit. To the women who learned to turn the narrowest margins of freedom into entire worlds. So when you hear the word courtesan, don't just think of luxury or scandal. Think of endurance. Of intelligence disguised as seduction. Of survival dressed in silk. They were not perfect. They were not saints. But they were, in their own way, pioneers, explorers of a forbidden kind of independence. The lights dim now. The stage is empty. The laughter fades into the soft hum of the modern world. But somewhere, in a museum or an attic or a half-remembered song, their presence lingers, delicate, defiant, eternal. Sleep now, knowing that history is not only built by those who conquered it openly, but also by those who danced through it quietly. The courtesans are gone, but their art, the art of self-invention, never truly dies. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, congratulations, or apologies, depending on how you meant to spend your night. We've drifted through palaces and drawing rooms, candlelight and perfume, poetry and scandal. The courtesans of Renaissance Italy, and all the glittering ghosts who followed them, have kept us company for hours, whispering across the centuries. And now, as the music fades and the room quiets, we've reached the gentle edge of their world. History, when you strip away the marble and myth, is really just a collection of people trying to make sense of their lives. Most fail quietly. Some fail beautifully. The courtesans did both. They were never meant to matter. In the official records, there are often footnotes, names scribbled beside kings, labeled as mistresses, companions, actresses, or worse. But in truth, they were architects of culture. They shaped taste, conversation, even politics, all while existing in spaces where they technically weren't allowed to exist at all. It's almost poetic, isn't it? That some of the most powerful figures of their age weren't queens or saints or soldiers. They were women society tried to erase, yet couldn't stop watching. There's something quietly rebellious about that. If you think about it, they lived in a paradox. They had everything and nothing at once, wealth without permanence, fame without safety, freedom with a leash attached. They dined with dukes, debated with philosophers, traded sonnets with poets. And yet, the moment beauty faded, the door closed. But within that brief window, they built empires of influence. One conversation at a time. One glance. One letter written at midnight to a man who would change his vote or fund an artist or start a war, all because she asked him to. They proved that power doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears silk. When we look back now, it's easy to romanticize them, to imagine a world of music and candlelight, where everything shimmered. But in truth, it was a world built on contradictions. A courtesan could inspire sonnets one day and ruin rumors the next. And maybe that's why their stories feel so haunting. Because they understood something that most people spend their lives avoiding, that beauty fades, love shifts, and control is always temporary. Yet they dared to live like it wasn't. There's a strange comfort in that, especially here, in the soft quiet before sleep. If history is full of empires built on conquest, theirs were built on connection. If most stories are about men who took what they wanted, theirs are about women who learned how to be wanted, and then decided how far that could take them. And it took them surprisingly far. They influenced fashion, art, language, even diplomacy. They were living bridges between the powerful and the creative, between wealth and imagination. And though many of them ended their lives in silence or poverty, their names outlived those who tried to forget them. There's Veronica Franco, the poet who refused to apologize for desire. There's Tullia d'Aragona, who dared to argue with philosophers about the nature of love. There's La Pava, who built a palace from 1,000 whispers. And even Leanne de Pogy, who traded diamonds for a rosary and found peace after a lifetime of noise. Each of them carried the same message, in her own way, that even within the narrowest boundaries, a person can still create art, meaning, and legacy. Maybe that's why we tell these stories at night. Because they remind us that history isn't just kings and wars and inventions. It's also about people who built entire worlds from the small freedoms they had. So if you ever walk through an old city, Venice, Paris, Florence, and pass a faded balcony or a cracked marble staircase, look up for a moment. Someone once stood there, centuries ago, wearing pearls and hope, pretending she ruled the world. And for a little while, she did. You can almost imagine her voice, faint in the dark. Everything fades, but not everything is lost. That's the quiet miracle of human vanity, that we keep trying to leave a trace, even knowing it won't last. The courtesans were no different. They loved, they performed, they existed in a world that both adored and condemned them. And still, somehow, they left us stories worth whispering long after they were gone. So as you lie there, maybe with the lights low and your mind starting to drift, think of them not as figures of scandal, but as artists of survival. They painted their lives with the only tools they had, beauty, intelligence, and time. And in a world that told them they had no place, they carved one anyway. It's strange how the echoes of their laughter still travel through centuries, through novels, paintings, films, even songs. Every time a story celebrates a woman for her wit as much as her beauty, you can feel their fingerprints somewhere in the background. They've never really left us. They just changed costumes. And now, their legacy lives on in quieter ways, in confidence, in independence, in the simple act of living as one chooses. That's the inheritance they left behind. History moves on, of course. It always does. But tonight, before it does, we can pause to remember that the most unlikely figures often leave the deepest marks. So here's to them, the forgotten queens of the half-world, the poets of persuasion, the women who made survival look like art. May they rest somewhere soft, under candlelight that never burns out. And may we, in our own small ways, learn a little from their courage, not to be perfect, not to be remembered forever, but to live vividly, even for a moment. If you're still awake, tell me, which of their stories stayed with you? Was it the poets of Venice, the rebels of Paris, or the silent saints of the modern age? I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments when your eyes open again. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, this quiet, winding path through beauty and irony, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who needs a peaceful night, or subscribing for more stories like this. Until next time, sleep well, dream gently, and remember, even the smallest life can leave a timeless echo. Hey everyone! If you're still with me, awake, half asleep, or somewhere in that gentle in-between, thank you for drifting this far. It's been a long night through marble halls, perfume-thick rooms, and the tangled lives of women who shaped their worlds one whisper at a time. History can be loud, wars, revolutions, declarations, but tonight we've listened to the quiet kind. The sort built out of glances and conversation, out of laughter that made kings forget their duties, and poems that dared to make desire sound like philosophy. The courtesans didn't command armies or write constitutions, but they changed the rhythm of entire centuries. Not through conquest, but through presence. Through the art of being unforgettable. And that might be the most human kind of power there is, not to rule by force, but by fascination. As we settle into this soft ending, I keep thinking about how their stories are stitched together by the same fragile thread, survival through self-invention. They lived in times that gave women so little room to breathe, and yet somehow, they turned that narrow corridor into a stage. Venice, Florence, Paris, wherever they appeared, the pattern was the same. Men wrote the rules, but courtesans rewrote them in real time, one velvet evening at a time. It's easy to romanticize them now, the gowns, the jewels, the candlelight. But beneath it all was something far more interesting, strategy. These women lived like chess players who could only ever move diagonally, and still found ways to win. Veronica Franco didn't just seduce. She wrote, argued, and published her own words at a time when most women weren't allowed a voice. Tullia d'Aragona debated philosophers on whether love could exist without physical desire. Centuries before psychology gave us vocabulary for that kind of thought. And La Pava. She didn't just chase wealth, she built an empire of it, brick by gilded brick. There's a certain elegance to that kind of audacity. They refused to be ornamental, even while the world insisted they were. But their stories also carry the melancholy of impermanence. The same beauty that opened doors would one day close them. The same charm that filled rooms with laughter would eventually fade into silence. They lived knowing that everything they built, every fortune, every moment of fame, had an expiration date. And still, they lived lavishly. Because what else can one do when time itself is temporary? Sometimes I think that's what makes their stories so soothing to hear at night. They remind us that everything ends, glory, youth, love, and that it's still worth living beautifully in between. You can imagine them, can't you? One by one, fading from the stage. The lights dim, the music stops, the curtains draw closed. And yet, even as they vanish, they leave behind something the world keeps chasing, a glimpse of freedom. The kind that exists even in captivity. As the centuries turned, they evolved. From Renaissance salons to Enlightenment soirees, from Parisian boudoirs to glittering theaters, the courtesans became reflections of each age's fantasies, but also its hypocrisies. The same men who moralized against them often paid for their company. The same societies that condemned them secretly built their art, their fashion, and their politics on the ripples they caused. It's strange, really, how often power and hypocrisy dance together through history. And the courtesans, they led the dance. When you think about it, they were the first influencers, long before the word existed. Their image was their brand, their wit their content, their audience a carefully curated network of nobles and dreamers. They monetized charisma centuries before anyone thought to film it. But unlike today's fame, theirs wasn't reproducible. It was personal, intimate, fragile, the kind of allure that only existed in conversation, not in pixels. That's part of why they've stayed in our collective imagination. They remind us of a time when power still required presence. When influence came from what you said in the room, not what you posted afterward. And yet, their stories never quite fit the easy narratives. They weren't saints or villains, victims or heroines. They were contradictions wrapped in silk, intelligent and reckless, generous and manipulative, free and captive all at once. Maybe that's why history tried to simplify them, to file them away as curiosities rather than complexities. It's easier that way. But the truth is more interesting. They were simply human, just unusually good at turning that humanity into art. I wonder how many of them imagined, in their quieter moments, that people centuries later would still be whispering their names. Probably none. They lived too urgently for legacy. But history has a way of keeping echoes alive, especially the beautiful ones. It's funny, we often think of history as the story of winners. But it's really the story of survivors. And no one embodied survival quite like the courtesans. They survived by adapting, turning exclusion into opportunity and desire into a kind of diplomacy. They weren't allowed to vote, but they shaped the men who did. They weren't permitted to rule, but they influenced those who wore crowns. Even their downfall, when the modern world arrived with cameras and tabloids, feels poetic. They had ruled through mystery, and mystery was the first casualty of the 20th century. You can't compete with a photograph. You can't outwit the lens. But they left behind the idea that identity could be crafted, that power could come from performance. It's an idea that lives on in every actress, every artist, every woman who decides how she'll be seen rather than waiting to be defined. That's their quiet legacy, not the scandals, not the wealth, but the act of self-creation. And now, as this long, soft night reaches its final minutes, it feels right to slow down even more, to let the noise of the centuries dissolve into something gentle. Because beyond the glamour and irony, there's something almost meditative about their stories. They show us that control is temporary, reputation fragile, and beauty fleeting, but meaning, strangely, survives. Not in monuments or crowns, but in memory. If you've stayed with me through this, maybe you've felt a little of what I feel every time I write these stories, that quiet ache of recognition. The sense that even in a world so different from ours, people were never that different at all. They wanted to be seen, to be loved, to matter. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes their stories linger long after the candles go out. Let's rest here for a moment. The noise of history has dimmed to a hum. You can almost hear the soft scrape of a quill, the distant murmur of a salon, the faint laughter of a woman who knows she's already won the room. We'll let her have the last laugh for now. Hey, everyone! Still awake? Or maybe you're somewhere in between, half listening, half drifting, floating somewhere between Florence and a warm, comfortable bed. Either way, we're still wandering through the slow decline of the courtesan age, the point where the shimmer of Renaissance freedom began to fade into the powdered calm of the Enlightenment. You can almost feel it, can't you? The candles are smaller now, the music quieter. The laughter that once filled the palaces of Venice sounds softer, as if the people telling jokes are aware that the walls have ears again. The century has turned, and the courtesans, those once powerful women who balanced intellect, wit, and seduction like a fine glass of wine, are beginning to lose their footing. Not because they've changed, but because the world around them has. By the early 1700s, Europe had fallen deeply in love with propriety. The Church, once scandalized and then grudgingly tolerant of its glittering sinners, decided to tighten the rules again. Venice, which had once been the city of masks and pleasure, began to turn prudish. Paris, that noisy city of salons, suddenly wanted everything codified, categorized, and filed under respectable. And of course, when a society gets nervous about its morals, the first thing it does is pretend women don't have any power. The courtesans, who had once been stars in their own right, poets, conversationalists, advisors to men who couldn't think clearly without their guidance, now found their influence recast as something embarrassing, something old-fashioned. It's always like that in history, isn't it? The people who shape an age rarely survive its fashions. Let's drift for a moment to Paris, sometime around 1720. The streets are cleaner than they used to be, or at least they try to be. The nobles, bored after a century of excess, are now obsessed with order. The philosophers have begun writing about reason. Everything must be rational. Everything must be explained. Of course, love and art have never cared much for reason. Still, the courtesans try to adapt. They exchange their flowing Renaissance silks for the tighter corsets and structured gowns of the Rococo age. Their salons become less about flirtation and more about ideas. You could say the courtesan becomes the hostess now, her bed less a political stage, and her table more of an intellectual one. If you listen closely, you can hear their new voices echo through the salons of Paris. Madame de Tencin, who began as a nun and ended as a literary patron, entertaining Voltaire and Montesquieu. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, who essentially ran the French court for over a decade, and did so not through scandal, but through conversation, grace, and political poise. It's funny, really. For centuries, the world had whispered that women were too emotional to be trusted with influence. And yet, here they were, managing kings, shaping policy, setting artistic trends, all while smiling politely as if they were just pouring tea. Let's be honest, it takes a certain kind of genius to play dumb while outsmarting a nation. Still, the old courtesans, the artists, the poets, the dreamers, might have found this new world too stiff. The laughter that once flowed through Venice's palaces now felt replaced by philosophy debates and etiquette manuals. There was less poetry, less music. The sensual became intellectual, and while the salons sparkled, something in them felt carefully staged. The courtesans had been magicians of emotion. Their replacements were curators of wit. And yet, despite everything, traces of that old power still lingered. Pompadour herself, who rose from relatively humble origins, commanded more respect from her king than most noblewomen. She read voraciously, advised on art commissions, and effectively became France's unofficial minister of culture. But what people rarely mention is how fragile her position was. The moment her beauty began to fade, she reinvented herself as a friend to the king, not his lover, but his companion and counselor. She knew the rules better than anyone. A woman could be wise, powerful, and elegant, as long as she never admitted that she knew it. It's the same trick the Renaissance courtesans had mastered centuries earlier, just performed now in pastel colors and powdered wigs. If you've ever wondered how women navigated power in a world that wasn't designed for them, you don't need to look at battles or laws, just at the courtesans and the saloniers. They didn't fight wars. They fought with words. And sometimes, that's the quieter kind of victory. Still, history has a way of softening rebellion into romance. By the 19th century, when writers began looking back on these women, they saw them not as pioneers, but as tragic heroines, lovely, misunderstood creatures destroyed by love. It's almost funny how men have always preferred women powerful enough to fascinate them, but not enough to unsettle them. Think of Alexander Dumas' Camille, or Verdi's La Traviata. Both inspired by real courtesans, the kind who lived too freely for their time and paid the price in tears and tuberculosis. Art adored them, but only once they were safely fictional and dead. You could say that was the final transformation, the courtesan as symbol, not person. And yet, there's something haunting about that transition. These women, who once ruled rooms with wit sharper than any sword, now became ghostly icons of fallen virtue. The world loved to weep for them, but it had little patience for listening to them. That's the strange afterlife of power. Once you lose it, people start calling you poetic. Let's drift for a moment to another image, a woman in a small Parisian apartment, perhaps around 1850. The walls are covered in fading wallpaper. On the table, there's a single silver hairbrush, worn smooth with years of use. She's older now, and no longer receives letters sealed with crests. But in her day, she knew every poet in the city, every secret worth knowing. The world outside has moved on. There are trains now, and newspapers, and revolutions. No one calls her a courtesan anymore. They use new words like actress or demi-mondaine. The vocabulary has changed, but the rules haven't. Still, she smiles as she remembers the candlelit rooms, the sound of laughter on marble floors, the way conversation once felt like a performance. She knows she's been erased from polite memory, but she doesn't mind. Because in her own quiet way, she knows she shaped the world that forgot her. It's a comforting thought. That influence doesn't always vanish when applause fades. Sometimes, it becomes the rhythm behind everything that comes after. And maybe that's why we still talk about them, centuries later, half asleep and far from their time. Because even if their names blur, their presence remains. Think of all the modern echoes, the performers, the muses, the influencers, the women who navigate fame and gaze and reputation with a practiced smile. You can draw a line, faint but real, from the courtesans of Venice to the icons of today. Same questions. Same trade-offs. Same quiet negotiations between autonomy and admiration. History never really ends, it just changes costumes. Maybe that's why stories like these feel so strangely soothing at night. Because they remind us that every generation believes it's inventing something new, when really it's just repeating a very old dance, the dance between visibility and control. The courtesans learned it by candlelight. We learn it by screen light. Different glow, same performance. As you listen now, maybe part of you can feel that resonance, the idea that beauty and intelligence have always been both weapon and shield, sometimes even both at once. And as history moved on, the courtesan faded from the stage. But she didn't vanish. She just became harder to recognize. Every actress who turned her image into power, every writer who turned her heartbreak into fame, every woman who decided to survive her own myth, they're all her descendants in a way. The world just calls them something else now. And maybe, in the end, that's the only kind of immortality anyone gets. Being remembered, not as who you were, but as what you became in someone else's imagination. So if you're still awake, tell me in the comments, what do you think happened to them? Did the courtesans truly vanish, or did they just evolve into something the world still doesn't quite understand? It's an open question, and the answer might depend on how sleepy you are right now. Let's drift onward, gently, quietly, into the next part of this long night of history. Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you're settled in comfortably, lights dim, maybe a blanket tucked around your shoulders. Tonight, we're gliding deeper into the whispering corridors of Renaissance Italy, where beauty, intellect, and quiet cunning often mattered more than crowns. We've seen how courtesans rose from scandalous beginnings to unexpected power. But now, let's explore what happened when they learned to wield that power, quietly, gracefully, and sometimes mercilessly. Let's start in Rome, around the early 1500s, an age when marble saints stared down at the streets, and cardinals whispered about sin as they walked straight into it. Rome was supposed to be holy. It was, after all, the heart of Christendom. Yet, beneath its gilded domes, it pulsed with intrigue, indulgence, and an endless appetite for pleasure. And at the center of that paradox stood women like Imperia Cognati, known simply as Imperia, because one name was enough. Imperia was Rome's most celebrated courtesan. Born to humble origins, She reinvented herself with such precision that even cardinals forgot where she came from. She had poets as her admirers and bankers as her clients. Her home was said to be more refined than the palaces of some nobles. She spoke Latin, quoted Petrarch, and could discuss theology with the same ease she recited love poetry. A pope's cousin once remarked that Imperia's salon had more intellect than the curia. Which, to be fair, wasn't saying much. She wasn't just a companion, she was a symbol of cultivated sin. Her house, filled with art and perfumed candles, became a refuge for scholars, painters, and wealthy men escaping the dull virtue of their arranged marriages. Imperia treated her life like a performance. Every gown, every gesture, every word was measured. And in a world where women were expected to obey, she made men wait for her attention. Her secret wasn't beauty, though she had that in abundance, it was control. The subtle art of never appearing desperate. In her salon, powerful men paid not just for affection but for an illusion of equality. For a few hours, they could believe that they were understood, admired, maybe even loved. And Imperia, always serene, allowed them that fantasy. But of course, fantasies can be fragile. In 1512, Imperia died suddenly, rumored to have taken poison. Some whispered that she'd grown tired of her life, or that a lover betrayed her. Others said she simply saw her beauty fading, and refused to watch the curtain fall. Even in death, she remained mysterious. Her funeral was paid for by the same men who once adored her in secret. Her tombstone read, "To Imperia, who lived with more fame than any woman of her age." It was both an epitaph and an accusation. Let's drift northward, to Venice, city of reflections. In Venice, power and pleasure were practically state-sanctioned. The city was rich, clever, and just cynical enough to make hypocrisy an art form. Courtesans here weren't outcasts, they were institutions. The Venetian elite couldn't flaunt their wives, but they could parade a famous courtesan like a fine painting. One of the most famous was Veronica Franco. Unlike Imperia, Veronica left behind her voice, written, sharp, impossible to silence. She was born in 1546 into a family that practically groomed her for the life. Her mother, a former courtesan herself, taught her the rules of the game: how to speak elegantly, how to write verse, how to make a man feel like his opinion mattered, without ever actually agreeing with him. Veronica became the darling of Venetian society. Poets compared her to Venus. Nobles competed to be seen with her at masked balls. She corresponded with scholars, debated moralists, and published poetry, real poetry, not the kind written by ghostwriters for decoration. In her letters, she defended women's intellect and mocked the double standards of her society. When accused of immorality, she asked, softly, "Why should I be condemned for what men seek out so eagerly?" Of course, Venice loved her wit right up until it didn't. When the plague struck and the city turned inward, people needed scapegoats. Veronica, the once celebrated courtesan, suddenly became a convenient target. She was accused of witchcraft, a standard punishment for women who'd once been admired too much. She stood before the Inquisition, calm and articulate. They couldn't prove anything, and eventually they let her go. But her reputation never fully recovered. Still, her words endured. In one of her poems, she wrote to a young man who'd underestimated her, "You will learn too late that you mocked a woman who could outthink you." She wasn't wrong. There's something almost meditative about these lives. The way they danced between admiration and ruin, always balancing on the edge of respectability. Courtesans in Renaissance Italy existed in a strange liminal space, half scandal, half muse. They were simultaneously excluded from polite society and essential to its functioning. And that duality gave them an odd kind of freedom. A noblewoman couldn't write letters to a prince or host a salon full of scholars, but a courtesan could. A duchess had to obey her husband, but a courtesan could choose hers, at least for a while. It's easy, from a modern bed, to think of their world as cruel and shallow. But remember, these women carved influence from the few tools they had. In a society obsessed with lineage, they built fame from conversation and poetry. They wielded knowledge as armor, wit as currency, and beauty as leverage. Let's drift now into Florence, the city that never quite knew how to handle women with opinions. Florence was the playground of the Medici, that family of bankers turned princes who collected both art and enemies. It was also home to courtesans who, like Veronica, understood that influence often came not from direct power, but from proximity to it. One name that lingers faintly in Florentine gossip is Camilla Pisana. She wasn't as famous as Imperia or as literary as Veronica, but she understood something essential about the Renaissance mind. It loved spectacle. Camilla became known for her theatrical approach to charm. She would host elaborate dinners where musicians played while philosophers argued, and she would sit quietly at the center, saying little. People mistook her silence for depth, which, honestly, worked out nicely for her. Camilla's clients included members of the Medici court. She listened more than she spoke, learning secrets no one intended to share. It's said she once convinced a Florentine noble to fund a new artist simply because she wanted to see what he'd paint. That artist turned out to be a young apprentice named Bronzino. So, in a small way, she left her mark on art history. Not bad for someone society pretended didn't exist. Florence was also home to a certain hypocrisy about sin. Everyone loved the beauty of the nude Venus in art, but they hated the real women who inspired them. Courtesans were praised in verse and condemned in sermons, often by the same men. And yet, despite the sermons, despite the risks, their salons became incubators of culture. A young artist might get his first patron there. A poet might find his first audience. Ideas about love, virtue, and freedom were debated over wine and candlelight, while outside, the church bells reminded everyone to repent. Courtesans, in their strange way, kept the Renaissance alive. They were walking contradictions, living proof that beauty and intellect could coexist, that morality wasn't as clear as the preachers claimed. Let's pause for a moment here, softly. Imagine the sound of rain against cobblestones outside a Venetian window. Inside, candlelight flickers on silk and parchment. A woman, draped in crimson, leans forward as a man reads her a sonnet he wrote, badly. She smiles anyway. She knows that what he really wants isn't her approval, but the illusion that he's inspired her. It's a small exchange, but in it lies the entire dance of Renaissance courtship. A performance of power, wrapped in politeness. Tell me, if you lived in that time, do you think you'd have dared to attend one of these salons? To sip wine with poets and prelates, listening to gossip disguised as philosophy? Or would you have stayed safely outside, whispering about them instead? Let me know in the comments. After all, history is just a long conversation. And as we drift toward the next part, let's stay in this half-lit world of candlelight and contradiction, where power wore perfume and influence came dressed as affection. Because next, we'll move deeper into how these courtesans began to shape politics, not from thrones, but from pillows and poetry. For now, take a slow breath. The night in Renaissance Italy is still young, and the stories are just getting softer. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle in again. Maybe your tea has gone cold by now, or maybe you're already half dreaming. That's all right. Tonight, we're not in any rush. We're drifting back into Renaissance Italy, into the corners of courts and salons where the real decisions were made, not by kings or popes, but by the women sitting quietly beside them. By now, you know that courtesans were far more than entertainers. They were conversation partners, advisors, and sometimes, the last voice a powerful man heard before making a disastrous choice. They learned that words whispered in the right ear could move armies, shift alliances, and rewrite fortunes. We'll begin in Mantua, a small duchy, rich in art and ambition, ruled by the Gonzaga family. Mantua didn't have the size or military might of Florence or Venice, but it had something perhaps more potent: subtlety. The court of Isabella d'Este, one of the most cultured women of her time, was a beacon of refinement. And, naturally, where refinement gathered, courtesans followed. One of them was a woman known as Lucrezia Bendidio. She came from Ferrara, a place famous for producing both poets and scandals, often in equal measure. Lucrezia was less flamboyant than her Roman or Venetian counterparts. She preferred to charm through wit and music. It's said she could calm an argument between nobles just by picking up a lute. Which, honestly, was probably the Renaissance equivalent of muting a Twitter thread. She caught the attention of several courtiers, including the poet Torquato Tasso, who fell disastrously in love with her. His obsession inspired some of his most beautiful verses, and some of his most unhinged ones. Lucrezia, for her part, managed to stay graceful throughout, neither rejecting him outright nor encouraging his fantasies too much. She had a gift for letting men believe what they needed to. At the Gonzaga court, Lucrezia became a subtle kind of diplomat. Foreign envoys would attend Isabella's salons, sipping wine, trading compliments, and then, later that night, they'd visit Lucrezia. What began as flirtation often became negotiation. Secrets were exchanged with kisses, promises with sighs. Letters passed from her hand to a messenger could decide whether Mantua allied with Milan or Ferrara. There's an almost dreamlike quality to it, isn't there? The notion that great affairs of state might hinge on the quiet logic of affection rather than the clash of swords. But that's what Renaissance Italy was, a patchwork of city-states where everything was balanced on vanity and persuasion. Let's drift over to Florence again, where politics was practically a blood sport. By the mid-1500s, the Medici family had clawed their way from merchants to monarchs. Their rule was absolute, or at least they liked to think so. But even the Medici princes had weaknesses, and Florence's courtesans knew exactly how to find them. One of the most intriguing was Tullia di Aragona. She was the daughter of another famous courtesan, Julia Campana, and, depending on which gossip you believe, an illegitimate child of a cardinal. That alone gave her a strange kind of pedigree, too noble to be dismissed, too scandalous to be respectable. Tullia wasn't content with mere charm. She wanted to be remembered as a thinker. She wrote treatises on love and philosophy, debating whether desire could ever be virtuous. Her book, Dialogue on the Infinity of Love, was shocking not just because a woman had written it, but because it dared to intellectualize something the Church considered shameful. She argued that love, when guided by reason, could elevate the soul. It was a clever defense of her profession, couched in philosophical language. Essentially, she told the moralists, "I'm not corrupting men. I'm helping them reach enlightenment, one conversation at a time." And somehow, she got away with it. Her salons in Florence attracted poets, scholars, and diplomats. She was often consulted on matters of etiquette and politics, because she understood the delicate dance of pride that ruled the city. A Florentine ambassador once remarked that a night spent in Tullia's company was worth a month at court. Which probably meant she was more efficient at getting people to talk. She had relationships with powerful men, some romantic, others purely strategic. Unlike many of her peers, she refused to be maintained by one patron. She insisted on independence, earning her living through writing and performance. For a woman in the 16th century, that was practically revolutionary. And yet, beneath the philosophy and grace, there was loneliness. Tullia knew she would never truly belong in the world she influenced. She was too clever for the church, too scandalous for the court, too proud to settle for being anyone's secret. In her later years, she faded quietly, her name kept alive by poets who quoted her lines long after forgetting her face. Let's linger a moment on that thought, the way fame fades differently for women. Male scholars of the Renaissance were immortalized in marble and paint, courtesans were remembered in sighs and rumors. Their legacies survived in poems, half-true anecdotes, and portraits that may or may not even be them. There's something gently tragic about that, but also oddly fitting. The Renaissance adored beauty precisely because it was fleeting. Let's move to Milan now, where politics was sharper, colder. The Sforza dukes ruled with suspicion, surrounded by spies and flatterers. Here, courtesans weren't just companions, they were information brokers. The French ambassador once complained that it is impossible to keep a secret in Milan. Even the women of pleasure are in the pay of rival lords. One of them, Chiara Visconti, became almost legendary. She wasn't noble by birth, but her intelligence earned her entry into elite circles. Chiara specialized in discretion. She never hosted salons, never flaunted her lovers. She preferred private meetings, candlelight, quiet words. It's said she once helped broker peace between two rival condottieri, mercenary generals, simply by convincing both that she loved them more than the other. Whether that's true or not hardly matters. What's important is that people believed it could be. That alone was a measure of her power. In Milan, as in so many courts, courtesans filled the void left by politics too ruthless for honesty. Men could confess their doubts to them without fear of losing face. They could share rumors, ask advice, even test their plans aloud. Courtesans listened, smiled, and remembered. In an age before newspapers, they were the living press, discreet, influential, and perfectly aware of their value. And that value wasn't lost on rulers. Letters from the Sforza archives reveal that courtesans were often used as unofficial envoys. They could travel freely, pass messages, gather information. They were less conspicuous than diplomats and far more persuasive. A smile could go where a soldier could not. You can almost picture it, a carriage rattling through the Lombard plains at dawn, a woman inside adjusting her veil, carrying not jewels but documents hidden in her sleeve. She arrives at a villa, greeted by a nobleman pretending surprise. They dine, they talk, and somewhere between the wine and the candlelight, alliances are secured. Soft power, indeed. And yet, it was dangerous work. A courtesan who played politics too boldly could fall overnight. A lover's wife might seek revenge. A jealous rival could whisper accusations. The church could turn moral outrage into punishment. Many ended up imprisoned, exiled, or simply erased from polite memory. Still, for a few decades, they held a curious kind of sway. Kings, dukes, and popes might rule cities, but courtesans ruled moods. They shaped reputations, brokered introductions, softened egos. They were the oil in the creaky machinery of Renaissance diplomacy. If you think about it, this world feels strangely familiar. Influence today might come through microphones and screens, rather than salons and sonnets, but the principle isn't so different. Power still listens more willingly when it's flattered. Imagine sitting in one of those dim Florentine rooms, silk curtains drawn, the hum of conversation mixing with the soft music of a lute. A courtesan sits nearby, listening to two men debate the future of their alliance. She says little, but when she does, her words carry weight. One sentence, delivered at the right time, might change a treaty. Tell me, if you were her, would you speak? Or would you let them talk themselves into ruin? Let me know in the comments. I suspect I know what most of you would do. But before we drift too far into modern comparisons, let's remember, these women paid dearly for their autonomy. They had freedom, yes, but it was a conditional kind, borrowed from the whims of men. When beauty faded or scandal struck, society was quick to remind them where they stood. Still, for those brief, golden years, they managed to shape history in ways historians rarely admit. They weren't on the thrones, but they were behind them, unseen and essential. The poet Pietro Aretino once wrote that, without courtesans, men would have no muse, no mirror, and no mercy. He was being dramatic, of course, but not entirely wrong. So tonight, as we drift toward the next part, let's imagine the flicker of torchlight fading from the canals of Venice, the echo of laughter dying in a Roman courtyard. The power plays have quieted. The courtesans, their jewels set aside, are writing letters by candlelight, letters that might change the course of kingdoms. And perhaps, just perhaps, they smile faintly as they seal the wax. After all, influence rarely needs to shout. Tell me, what do you think? Is quiet power the most dangerous kind? Leave your thoughts below. I'll be curious to see what you think when you're fully awake again. Let's drift onward, softly, to the next part, where we'll see how the world finally began to turn against these women, and how the Renaissance slowly shut its doors on them. For now, let's rest in the hush of candlelight. The city sleeps, and history whispers. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are growing heavy, that's fine. Tonight's story is made for drifting. We're moving gently now into the late Renaissance, the slow dusk that settled over Italy when the world began to change, and not necessarily for the better. The 1500s had been an age of splendor. Gold-threaded gowns, painted ceilings, poetry read aloud in candlelight. Courtesans had become symbols of beauty and wit, the muses and mirrors of their age. But as the century waned, so did tolerance. The same society that once admired clever sin began to rediscover guilt. The Reformation had torn Europe in half. The church, shaken and defensive, started cleaning house, sometimes violently. In Italy, that meant moral reform campaigns, sermons against vanity, and a newfound suspicion of pleasure. Rome, once a playground for popes, turned its gaze toward discipline. And naturally, that meant the courtesans would have to go. Let's begin again in Venice, where the decline first showed its cracks. For centuries, Venice had treated its courtesans as part of the city's charm, half art, half scandal. Travelers came for the gondolas, the architecture, and, well, the company. But in the late 1500s, the Senate began issuing decrees to limit the public presence of immoral women. It was less about morality and more about optics. Venice's image as a decadent pleasure capital had become inconvenient in a new Europe obsessed with virtue. Veronica Franco, whom we met earlier, lived long enough to feel that shift. In her youth, she had dined with nobles and written poetry that compared desire to divine inspiration. But as the plague and the Inquisition arrived, those same poems were used against her. Her fame, once her shield, became evidence of pride, a mortal sin, apparently, when committed by women. She was summoned before the Inquisition, accused of witchcraft and heresy. Her crime? Being too articulate, too beautiful, too free. She defended herself calmly, pointing out the hypocrisy of her judges. They released her, yes, but she never truly recovered. Her patrons disappeared. Her name, once whispered in admiration, became something to avoid. By the time she died, she was nearly forgotten. There's a quiet sadness in that kind of erasure. The world that had built her up on flattery suddenly pretended she had never existed. It's a pattern that history loves to repeat. Let's drift south to Rome again, where the church was performing its own moral makeover. The same streets that had once echoed with laughter from the villas of Imperia and Fiammetta now echoed with sermons. Cardinals who once wrote love poems now issued condemnations. The courtesans who remained found themselves watched, censored, and often arrested. A 1592 edict declared that no woman of dishonor may dress in silk, pearls, or gold. Imagine that, beauty itself becoming contraband. The women who had once been admired for their elegance now risked imprisonment for wearing lace. It was as if the city had decided to punish them for reminding everyone of what they'd lost: joy, spontaneity, and a little bit of human warmth. Some adapted. They reinvented themselves as actresses or musicians, hiding their pasts under new titles. Others fled to smaller cities where the laws were looser. But most simply faded, leaving behind the faintest trace in letters, diaries, or portraits mislabeled as unknown woman. In Florence, the transformation was even harsher. The Medici, now Grand Dukes under Spanish influence, had adopted stricter Catholic customs. Public morality was a tool of politics, displayed as a sign of stability and divine favor. The lively salons of earlier decades disappeared. Courtesans were no longer celebrated. They were inconvenient reminders of an unrulier past. Some Florentines tried to resist the new prudence. Poets still wrote verses about unattainable women, but the real women behind those poems were carefully unnamed. Art still adored the nude form, but models were now hidden behind mythological disguises. Venus could stay, but Veronica could not. And yet, even in decline, courtesans left their fingerprints everywhere. They had shaped taste, language, and the very idea of romance. The art of conversation, once refined in their salons, spread into noble courts and later, into the drawing rooms of Europe. If you've ever seen a painting of a woman reclining gracefully while a man reads to her, you've seen their legacy. Let's wander now through one of those fading salons in our minds. The candles are fewer. The laughter is quieter. A courtesan in her 40s, once the toast of Florence, now entertains fewer guests. She wears simpler gowns, more modest jewelry. The poets who once adored her are old or dead. A new generation of moralists has taken over the city. She still knows how to charm, how to make a room glow with calm conversation, but she feels the weight of the years pressing closer. She writes letters to patrons who no longer reply. Sometimes she reads her old poems aloud to herself, just to remember the sound of her own name being spoken with admiration. It's not hard to imagine her glancing out the window, hearing church bells ring, and thinking how strange it is that holiness and loneliness sound the same from a distance. That's the quiet truth of decline. It doesn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it's just silence, replacing applause. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing faster than any courtesan could keep up. Exploration had shifted attention westward. New trade routes, new money, new power centers. Italy, once the beating heart of art and philosophy, was now being overshadowed by Spain, France, and England. And with that, its old culture of indulgence faded. In Spain, strict Catholic morality left no room for courtesans of the Venetian kind. In France, royal mistresses existed, but they belonged to a different world, one of rigid court protocol rather than free salons. And in England, well, the Puritans were on the rise. They didn't even like music, let alone conversation with fallen women. The Renaissance had loved contradictions, beauty and sin, intellect and pleasure. But the Baroque age preferred order. Things had to fit into neat categories: saint or sinner, wife or whore, divine or damned. There was no space left for the courtesan's elegant ambiguity. Still, a few ghosts lingered. In the 1600s, travelers wrote wistfully of the old Venetian courtesans, as if they were relics from a gentler time. Poets romanticized them as tragic heroines, symbols of lost freedom. Even as society erased them, art couldn't quite let them go. Painters like Caravaggio, who loved the edges of morality, still used women like them as models for saints and sinners alike. The same woman might appear as the Virgin Mary in one painting and as Mary Magdalene in another. It was, in a way, their final form of rebellion, to exist in sacred art long after the Church had condemned them. And maybe that's the most poetic justice of all. Think of it, a world that tried to silence women of beauty and intellect, only to immortalize their faces on chapel walls. People kneeled before altarpieces without realizing they were praying to the likeness of a courtesan. History has a dry sense of irony that way. Let's pause for a moment. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the soft echo of that vanished world, the rustle of silk skirts, the pluck of a lute, the low hum of conversation fading into prayer. The Renaissance didn't end with a bang. It exhaled, slowly, until the air was still. Tell me, if you'd lived then, would you have adapted to the new morality? Would you have hidden your books, your laughter, your jewelry, pretending to repent for a freedom you once cherished? Or would you have quietly defied it all, knowing that even silence can be a kind of rebellion? Let me know in the comments. I suspect many of you would have chosen rebellion, at least softly. And as we drift toward the close of this long story, it's worth remembering that decline isn't failure, it's just transformation. The courtesans didn't vanish, they evolved. Their spirit, the art of charm, conversation, and subtle power, moved into new spaces, the French salons, the theaters, even early journalism. Whenever a woman uses her intellect to navigate a system not built for her, she carries a little of that Renaissance spirit. So as we leave the candlelight of Italy behind, think of those courtesans not as fallen women, but as early architects of modern identity, flawed, clever, human. They made the best of a narrow world and, for a moment, made it beautiful. Let's drift onward to our final part next, where we'll explore how their legend survived, reshaped by art, myth, and memory, and how their voices, once whispered, still echo softly through history. For now, rest easy. The night is deep, and the past is gentle. Let's drift upward now, away from the damp alleys of Whitechapel and into another world entirely. The carpets are thicker here, the curtains heavier, the perfume stronger. This was the other half of Victorian prostitution, the part no one spoke of in sermons. The gilded brothels, where the rich indulged their desires with all the hypocrisy that money could buy. If the streets below smelled of gin and despair, these rooms smelled of roses and imported tobacco. Clients arrived in carriages, not on foot. The women wore silk instead of satin, and their laughter was rehearsed to sound elegant, not desperate. They were not called prostitutes here. They were courtesans. A nicer word, softer on the ear, easier for gentlemen to repeat over brandy. These establishments were hidden in plain sight. Elegant houses in Mayfair, or discreet apartments off Piccadilly. From the outside, they looked like any other well-kept home, with polished knockers and lace-curtained windows. Inside, they were playgrounds of indulgence, decorated with oil paintings, velvet divans, and mirrors placed exactly where the imagination wanted them. The madams here were less brothel keepers and more businesswomen. They moved in polite society, knew which wines to serve, and often entertained their clients' wives at tea. Everyone knew, of course, the wives, the husbands, the servants, but no one ever said a word. The entire performance depended on silence. And the courtesans, they were the stars of the show. Educated, charming, witty, and devastatingly self-aware. Many had begun life as governesses or actresses before discovering that wit and beauty could earn far more than moral virtue ever would. They were invited to the theater, to dinners, even to the races, though always as someone's guest. Newspapers whispered about them in code, a certain lady of distinction, the mysterious beauty seen in Lord So-and-so's carriage. Everyone knew who they meant. The most famous among them became celebrities in their own right. There was Harriet Wilson, for instance, who famously blackmailed her former lovers, including half the British aristocracy, by threatening to publish her memoirs unless they paid her to stay quiet. Many paid. She did it anyway. Her book, filled with scandal and charm, became an instant sensation. People condemned it publicly while reading it privately by candlelight. Then there was Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, who rode through Hyde Park in the most fashionable attire London had ever seen. She was adored, envied, and imitated. Her lovers included dukes, princes, and even royalty. She managed her affairs, both financial and romantic, with more precision than most bankers. When she retired, she was wealthy, respected in her own odd way, and quietly content. In the grand tradition of Victorian irony, she lived more securely than many respectable wives. Courtesans like Skittles lived at the intersection of scandal and admiration. They were publicly shunned, privately desired, and socially indispensable. They set trends in fashion, language, even etiquette. They could make or ruin a man's reputation with a whisper. They understood something few others did, that power, in a world built by men, could sometimes be borrowed rather than inherited. Their world was dazzling, but it was fragile too. Fame was fickle, beauty fleeting, and wealth temporary. A single scandal, a rumor too sharp, or a patron too vindictive could end it all overnight. There were no pensions for courtesans. Their fortunes rested on charm and health, and both eventually faded. When that happened, some managed to retire quietly into the countryside. Others drifted downward, from Mayfair salons to dimmer rooms and cheaper clients. Respectability, once lost, could never be regained. Still, while it lasted, the high-end brothel world was its own strange kingdom, a mirror of the aristocracy it served. The madams became queens, the courtesans courtiers, and the clients noble fools playing at romance. Everything was illusion, but the illusion was maintained with such artistry that it almost became real. Even the decor spoke of contradiction. The walls were covered with paintings of Greek goddesses, classical enough to suggest culture but revealing enough to suggest everything else. Books lay scattered on tables, Byron, Shelley, Voltaire, carefully chosen to imply intellect. A man might tell himself he was visiting for conversation, not pleasure. The room was designed to let him believe that lie. The servants in these establishments were trained to discretion. They opened doors silently, refilled glasses without eye contact, and pretended not to notice anything. Silence was part of the service. So was fantasy. The courtesans learned to listen, not just to words, but to egos. Every sigh, every complaint about Parliament or marriage, was a thread to pull gently. They became confidants, not companions. For many men, that was the true luxury. In that world, a clever courtesan could accumulate astonishing influence. Some received jewels, property, even houses in their own name. One, rumored to be the mistress of a cabinet minister, was said to have more political secrets than the newspapers. Whether she used them is anyone's guess. But it's easy to imagine her smiling quietly as powerful men grew nervous in her company. And yet, for all the silk and laughter, loneliness lingered beneath. The women could never fully belong to the world they served. They were admired but never invited, celebrated but never respected. At the opera, they were given the best seats, but always in the shadowed boxes, never center stage. They were living contradictions, both envied and erased. Sometimes, late at night, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, one might sit before her mirror and stare at her reflection for a long time. Beneath the diamonds and powder, she saw the same face she'd worn before the transformation, a girl from nowhere, still pretending to belong somewhere. Perhaps she'd smile. Perhaps she'd cry. Most simply learned to stop asking which was which. There's a strange kind of peace in that acceptance. To live entirely by illusion, and yet know it for what it is. Many of these women were sharper than their clients ever realized. They studied them, learned their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. Some took lovers for affection, but most took them for strategy. In a society that offered women little power, manipulation was simply a survival skill. And it wasn't just men who came calling. Some courtesans entertained noblewomen too, bored duchesses and lonely heiresses who found in them something like freedom. Their relationships were never spoken of, but the gossip traveled nonetheless. The brothels of London were far more diverse and far more fluid than the history books ever admit. Money, of course, dictated everything. High-end courtesans earned fortunes, enough to buy horses, jewels, and country homes. Some invested cleverly, disguising themselves as widows and renting out property under false names. Others funded artists, writers, and musicians, becoming patrons of the very culture that despised them. There's an irony there too. Victorian art and literature, so obsessed with purity, was often financed by sin. One painter, it said, modeled every female figure in his work after his favorite courtesan. Her likeness appeared in galleries across London, disguised as Venus, as Psyche, as every ideal of feminine virtue. Viewers admired her without realizing they were worshipping the face of someone society had condemned. Art, in its quiet rebellion, has always enjoyed that kind of mischief. Still, for every success story, there were 10 tragedies. The competition among courtesans was brutal, and the fall from favor swift. A younger face, a new fashion, a bad investment, that's all it took. The same society that indulged them delighted in watching them fail. Newspapers printed obituaries of former beauties with thinly veiled moral satisfaction. A life of luxury and ruin, they'd write, as if decay were proof of virtue regained. But occasionally, a woman beat the system. She'd retire with wealth, marry quietly, and vanish into respectability. Some even outlived their former clients, sitting comfortably in country estates paid for by secrets long forgotten. Those were the rare victories, the kind history seldom celebrates because they leave no moral lesson behind. It's easy now to romanticize the courtesans, to imagine them as glamorous rebels rather than survivors. But their world, for all its glitter, was still a gilded cage. The bars were made of gold instead of iron, but they held just the same. Their freedom was conditional, bought moment by moment, smile by smile. Still, it's hard not to admire their audacity. In a century that told women to be silent, they made fortunes from being heard. In a world obsessed with purity, they turned desire into power. And in a society that worshipped appearances, they mastered the art of being seen. As the 19th century waned, the courtesan's age began to fade. The rise of photography, journalism, and scandal-hungry tabloids made discretion harder to maintain. The world was changing, faster, louder, less forgiving. The velvet shadows gave way to electric light, and under that brightness, the illusions began to unravel. But for a while, they had lived like queens in exile, ruling their own hidden empire beneath the moral glare of Victorian virtue. And perhaps, in their own way, they won. Because when the great men of their age are forgotten, their names still linger, whispered, scandalous, alive. There's something oddly comforting in that thought. That history remembers not just the powerful, but the defiant. The ones who learned to play the game and, for a brief, shining moment, played it better than anyone else. If you could step into one of those houses tonight, hear the music, the laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, what would you think? Would you see sin, or simply survival wrapped in silk? Tell me in the comments what you'd have done if you'd lived in that world of velvet and illusion. Now, let's drift onward, into the next story waiting behind the curtains. Because even among the laughter and champagne, the end was already beginning. The centuries moved on, as they always do, without much sentiment for the people who made them interesting. The Renaissance faded into the Baroque, which swelled into the Enlightenment, and by the time the Industrial Age began to hum and clatter, the courtesans were gone. Or perhaps not gone, just changed, like everything else that refuses to die completely. Their names no longer appeared in polite conversation, but their spirit lingered in other disguises. The actress, the muse, the mistress, the woman who smiled just enough to make kings nervous. It's easy to forget that what the courtesans once represented was not sin or scandal, but possibility. In a world that caged women inside households and convents, they built a door. It wasn't an ideal door, it came with locks and dangers of its own, but it opened into something like freedom. They lived by their wits and survived by their charm, and they managed, somehow, to make art, conversation, and intelligence into a currency men would pay dearly for. The irony is that centuries later, society would try to dress that up as empowerment, forgetting that these women already did it, 500 years ago, in brocade gowns and borrowed jewels. By the time the 18th century arrived, the torch had been passed north to France. The great Parisian salons of the Enlightenment, those glittering rooms where philosophy was discussed as if it were gossip, were filled with women who owed a debt to the Italian courtesans. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, the most famous mistress of Louis XV, was less a scandalous lover and more a strategist. She sponsored artists, philosophers, architects. She dictated royal fashion. She advised on foreign policy. And, of course, she smiled beautifully while doing it. You can almost hear Veronica Franco applauding softly from somewhere in the afterlife. France refined what Italy had invented, turned it from artful seduction into a kind of politics. And by then, the idea of the powerful courtesan had become both irresistible and impossible. Everyone wanted the glamour. No one wanted to admit they envied it. So the world turned the courtesan into fiction, a safe place to admire her. Novels and operas appeared, telling her story again and again, but always with a moral ending, just to keep things respectable. She could be clever, beautiful, independent, as long as she died tragically by the third act. La Traviata, Camille, Manon Lescaut. They were all the same woman, really, a ghost of the Renaissance courtesan, wearing powdered wigs instead of pearls. Audiences wept for her, but they didn't want to be her. Perhaps that was the final victory of the courtesans. They became immortal by dying beautifully in art. And because of that, they never quite left us. Still, I wonder, and maybe you do too, if any of those real women, sitting by their windows in Venice or Rome, imagined this kind of afterlife. Did they think about legacy? Or were they too busy paying rent, managing clients, and avoiding scandal to care about posterity? History rarely tells us what they thought. It only tells us what men thought about them, which is not the same thing. And yet, their silence feels deliberate sometimes. Maybe they knew that mystery was their power, that to be slightly unknowable was to remain unforgettable. The world has always wanted to define women like them, to file them neatly under sinner, saint, muse, or manipulator. But the truth, as usual, was far less tidy. They were human, brilliant, foolish, witty, lonely. They wanted love and safety and the thrill of being admired. They were not saints, but they were not villains either. They were survivors, and survival rarely fits neatly into morality tales. Let's drift a little farther, past the paintings and poems, into the modern world. When people talk about Renaissance courtesans now, they do so with a kind of romantic haze, as if every woman who ever wore a pearl choker also recited poetry by candlelight. The reality, of course, was grittier. But maybe it doesn't matter. Myths have a purpose. They tell us what we wish were true. And maybe we want to believe that beauty and intelligence once carried their own kind of power, even if it came at a cost. When you look at the portraits that remain, Titian's glowing Venetian women, eyes half-lidded, skin luminous as fresh marble, you see a kind of quiet defiance. These were not the blank angels of medieval art. They were alive. They looked at you. They knew something you didn't. Maybe that was the scandal all along. By the 19th century, women everywhere were beginning to claim the freedoms that courtesans had once fought for alone. Education, art, independence, money, all those things that had once made a woman dangerous were now being repackaged as respectable. But history has a short memory for its pioneers. No one thanked the courtesans who walked first so others could stroll later. The Victorians, of course, would have fainted at the idea. It's funny, in a quiet sort of way, how moral societies always inherit their freedoms from people they once condemned. The courtesans were scolded by priests, envied by wives, and adored by poets, and yet they were the ones who taught Europe how to talk about love as something more than duty. They blurred the lines between pleasure and intellect, and they made art out of conversation. That's not a bad legacy for women the world preferred to forget. Sometimes I think the courtesans' greatest rebellion wasn't their beauty or their wit, it was their refusal to be boring. They lived in a world that expected women to fade quietly into domesticity, and they said no, thank you. They became the center of attention, even when that attention came at a price. There's something oddly restful about that defiance now. In a world that still tries to tell women how to behave, their laughter still echoes faintly, reminding us that joy itself can be resistance. And yes, they made mistakes. They misjudged lovers, overspent fortunes, and occasionally believed their own myths. But who hasn't? The difference is that theirs were written down, painted, whispered, preserved. And because of that, we can see them not as paragons or sinners, but as people, deeply flawed, utterly fascinating, and, in their way, free. Let's drift now to one last image, the closing curtain of this long, slow story. Picture a dim Venetian room in the early morning. The party is over. The candles are nearly spent. A courtesan sits at her dressing table, removing her jewelry, one piece at a time. Outside, a gondola glides silently past, its lantern flickering on the water. She looks into the mirror, not with vanity, but with a kind of tired peace. For a moment, she isn't performing. She's just herself. And that, perhaps, is her final victory. If you listen closely, you might still hear her voice in the quiet, patient, ironic, and amused. She would tell you not to pity her, and not to glorify her either. She'd say that life was complicated, that beauty fades, but that a clever story can last forever. She'd say that the world changes, but people don't, not really. And then she'd smile, the way she always did, as if she knew the punchline to a joke we never quite understood. So maybe that's the lesson the courtesans left us, that charm, intelligence, and humor are not sins, but survival skills. That you can live in a world determined to underestimate you and still find ways to win. That power, real power, often comes from knowing when to laugh softly and when to stay silent. Good night.